Order, order. Well, welcome again, Prime Minister, on your second appearance before the Liaison Committee. As was usual with your predecessor, and as we did with you last time, we told you in advance what the themes are to be, but of course you have no knowledge of what the questions are to be. Today, again, we have 4 themes. We start with your special interest, constitutional renewal, which will be led by Sir Patrick Cormack. Then we go on to global economic issues, oil, food and energy, led by Malcolm Bruce. Then managing the economic slowdown, led by John McFall. And international flashpoints, led by Mike Gapes. So we go straight into the first theme. Patrick.
Prime Minister, good morning. When you came before us last time, I ended the session by asking you if you were enjoying things. Have they got better?
This is the best job in the world, and it's the best job in the world because plenty other people are wanting this job.
Perhaps tell us who they are.
Perhaps I should start by paying a tribute to our colleague Gwyneth Dunwoody. I think everybody recognises that she was a great parliamentarian. That was proven by what she achieved on this committee, and I think she'll be sadly missed in all parts of the House.
Well, thank you for that, Prime Minister. I'm sure we would all echo those words, as she was a much-loved colleague. She had a zest for life, and she believed in enjoying herself, and she believed in sleep, and she believed in holidays. Now, we understand that you don't have much of the former and don't want much of the latter. Is that right?
I get plenty of sleep, only occasionally interrupted by my young children. And as far as holidays, I'm looking forward to a holiday. I hope everybody else is.
Well, I hope you'll take one. Now, Prime Minister, you've made this business of constitutional reform top of your agenda, and you've stressed often enough that you really believe that Parliament should be central to the nation's affairs. But this doesn't really sit terribly happily with your continued support of the government control of the parliamentary timetable, and on the insistence that every bill is timetabled. How do you square that particular circle?
Well, there is a legislative programme that arises from a political party's manifesto. We've got an obligation to the people of this country. If we put forward proposals in our manifesto, if the public then vote for that manifesto as they have, then we have a duty to move these proposals
yes, Prime Minister,
to the House of Commons.
That's okay so far as it goes, but until 1997, if a government wished to timetable a bill, it did it individually. It brought its motion to the floor of the House. It sought to justify things after there had been a long committee session. Now, immediately after the second reading, we're told what the timetable is going to be, and that is determined by the government. Now, that doesn't really fit easily with the Prime Minister who said he wants to put Parliament back at the centre.
It's determined in the end by the consent of Parliament. I think you know that.
We'll come off it with the large majority.
I think over the last year we have proven that we wish Parliament to take more responsibility. We are changing the power of the executive to declare war. We're changing the power of the executive to request dissolution, the power over the recall of Parliament, the power to ratify international treaties, the power to make key public appointments, pre-scrutiny of those people who are holding major public offices. I think there are 60 such appointments actually that are going to be before the House of Commons. The power to choose bishops has been taken away from the government, the power and appointment of judges. So I think we are proving that the executive is capable of devolving substantial power, and I think we are reinforcing the role of Parliament in areas where for too long the executive, through royal prerogative, exercised power. Parliament will now have a far bigger role. And I think you would be wrong to undervalue the changes that have been announced in the last year and the changes that are being made.
Well, the proof of the pudding, and many of us say much of it is window dressing, and that while...
Well, I don't accept that, Sir Patrick.
Of course you don't, no, but there we are. Let me move on, if I may, to Sir Alan Beath.
If I just make it clear, is it not clear that when there are major public appointments being made, previously simply made by government, but now there is scrutiny by the House of Commons, that is an improvement in the House of Commons' position? Equally, when it's matters of peace and war, the Intelligence and Security Committee's work, to give Parliament more authority in this is important. Now, of course, Parliament must prove, both through its committee system and through the work in the Chamber, that it is prepared to exercise these responsibilities in a way that commands support in the country.
But look, I just say very briefly there, you are the executive, and Parliament is not the executive, but Parliament calls the executive to account, and you are preventing the executive being called fully to account if you persist with your timetable notions. But
well, I don't accept that the changes in the last year have done anything other than reinforce the power of Parliament, and whether it's in the constitutional renewal bill, or whether it's in the changes in the organisation of the Intelligence and Security Committee, or the ways that we will determine Parliament's right to exercise its opinion on peace and war and on the ratification of treaties. This is an improvement in the position of the legislature in relation to the executive.
Well, we note all that, Prime Minister. Let's move on to Sir Alan, because he has got some questions on those points he'd like to ask.
Let me start, Prime Minister, with one of the things that's in the bill, and that's the role of the Attorney-General. The Attorney-General combines a ministerial role with an independent one, deciding on prosecutions, giving legal advice to the government, for which a measure of detachment is required. Why, contrary to previous practice, have you decided that the Attorney-General should attend all Cabinet meetings?
The Attorney-General is not a member of the Cabinet. The Attorney-General attends Cabinet meetings.
But in your case, you've asked her to attend all Cabinet meetings.
The Attorney-General does so in a capacity as the legal advisor to the government. But let me just explain, Sir Alan, what the major change is. We are limiting...
I want to answer the question why you have asked the present Attorney-General, which has not been the practice hitherto, to attend all Cabinet meetings throughout.
Well, if I may say so, the previous Attorney-General did attend most meetings of the Cabinet, and I don't believe it is the case that in the last 10 years the Attorney-General has rarely attended the Cabinet. The Attorney-General has mainly attended the Cabinet.
Previous attorneys, and they've given evidence to this effect, attended Cabinet meetings on request to deal with specific issues. You've told the Attorney-General, and she told my committee this, that you would like her to attend all Cabinet meetings. That is a shift in the balance between the independent legal role and the political role of the Attorney-General.
I don't see that as a major shift at all, and I think you're drawing the wrong conclusion. She's there in her position as the legal advisor to the government. If she's called on to give that advice, she does so, and I've invited her to attend the meetings on that basis. But previously, I think you will find that the prior Attorney-General attended the Cabinet fairly regularly.
Now, one of the consequences, though, is that the Attorney-General, if this persists, will be seen even more than now as part of the political leadership of government. And that makes it very difficult for the public to see the Attorney as acting independently over issues like stopping investigations by the Serious Fraud Office, for which in future the Attorney will have a statutory power that doesn't now exist under your bill, on issues like deciding whether a minister should be prosecuted or whether the government is open to legal proceedings. It's much more difficult to see the Attorney as independent if the Attorney is part of the very political leadership which may be in question.
Well, again, I don't accept the presumption of your question, because we are changing the role of the Attorney-General quite significantly. There is a very significant change to the status quo. The Attorney-General will cease to have any power to take decisions in individual cases except in cases related to national security. And that is the big change that is being proposed, and I think people should recognise that as a significant change. It would only be in cases of national security that the Attorney will have the power to take decisions.
But why don't you take responsibility for those decisions? After all, you're the person, not the Attorney, you're the person who knows about the national security issues, and you're accountable to Parliament on national security. The Attorney-General has a quite different and legal role. Aren't you again in danger of muddling the legal and the political?
I think, if I may say so, you're starting from a presumption that the Attorney-General should have nothing to do with the political system. I don't accept that. The Attorney-General is still the legal advisor to the government. But where individual cases are involved, except in the case of national security, he or she will cease to have any power to take these decisions. I think that is a major change, and I don't think in your questions you're recognising it to be such as it is. And I do think that it's right that the person with the legal expertise takes these decisions.
But you can't avoid the fact that there will be, as there has been in other cases, a perceived conflict of interest, including in national security cases. And in other walks of life, conflicts of interest either have to be removed or dealt with special transparency arrangements. You're not doing that.
If I may say, I don't know if these microphones are working well enough, but if I may say so, the Attorney General will only intervene in cases where national security is paramount. She will have to report to Parliament when she does so. She will give an annual report to Parliament on the exercise of her power. So I think we are not only narrowing the scope for the action of the Attorney General and strengthening, therefore, the independence of the prosecution authorities, but we are creating a system that is more transparent in the manner in which Parliament is both informed and given an annual report on these matters. And I think that is a very significant change, and I hope that the committee will come to recognise it to be so.
Let's just turn to another of your big interests in this bill, which is rights and responsibilities. If you behave irresponsibly by breaking the law, by drunk driving, for example, then you face a penalty. You lose an element of rights because you get a driving ban or a prison sentence. If you persistently refuse job offers, you lose benefit. But beyond that, are there any responsibilities which are involved in not being a good citizen, which will lead to loss of rights under your concept of balancing rights and responsibilities?
I think you've just seen the publication in the last few days of the Constitution for the National Health Service, which talks about both rights and responsibilities. If someone has a time for an appointment and then fails to take that up, then they cannot automatically be expected to be governed by the guarantees that apply to everybody else, that they should have an 18-week gap between the time they go to a doctor and receiving the treatment that they want. So rights and responsibilities are embedded also in the new National Health Service Constitution.
But let's move out of the area of a public service and look more generally at rights and responsibilities. If you're a bad-tempered recluse who doesn't get on with the neighbours and won't help at the village fete, you're not being a very responsible member of society. But you're not suggesting, are you, that there are rights which people can lose because they're not good citizens as we might like them to be? I
think in the case of antisocial tenants, there are indeed rights that they can lose if they're bad tenants and destroy the peace or harm the serenity of life of the neighbours.
But those are crimes or legally defined forms of antisocial behaviour, aren't they?
Yes, they tend to be set down in the legislation. But again, I'm talking to you about how we have gradually moved towards a situation where we do talk about the responsibilities that people have, that they have to exercise as good citizens. Isn't
the danger in all this that you dress up what is really, in the end, preaching about how we'd like people to behave? And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm the last person to complain about preaching. But it's confusing. It's confusing.
He does it regularly.
Yes, it's confusing giving guidance on how we'd like people to live and how society is improved if people behave responsibly towards each other. Confusing that with rights which actually can't be taken away and can be enforced. If you can't enforce responsibilities, what are they doing packaged up with rights?
Well, in some cases you can enforce responsibilities. That's what I'm referring to. Whether it's the health service patient who abuses the goodwill of the service by refusing to turn up for appointments that they've made, or whether it is the antisocial tenant that you've referred to who refuses to be a good neighbour and disrupts the life of the neighbour.
No,
then it is right for us to insist that these responsibilities be enforced by them being penalised in one way or another.
I didn't say the bad tenant. I said the bad-tempered neighbour who just doesn't get on with people and doesn't do very much in society.
Well, there are ways of describing that behaviour, that when that behaviour becomes in an extreme form and really hurting the whole neighbourhood, that action should be taken.
Well, I'd like to move on to my very good-tempered neighbour. And yesterday you were somewhat perplexed as to how he should be rewarded. Well, he's been rewarded by being given the opportunity to ask you some questions today.
I don't know whether that's being shortchanged.
He's not.
Prime Minister, I want to ask you about...
He's not over sending me letters on this occasion.
I want to ask you about your counter-terrorism proposal. Some have argued quite strongly that the proposals that have been put forward by the government will affect the constitutional settlement in this country, because for the first time, Parliament and the Home Secretary will be asked to be involved in a judicial process once it has begun. What is your answer to that?
I don't accept that. The Home Secretary would come to the House with the support of the Director of Public Prosecutions and the police and say a terrorist incident has occurred. It is of a grave and exceptional nature, and on that basis she wishes to trigger the commencement order for the legislation. It is as straightforward as that. She is not involving herself in the action on the individual case, which is a matter for the courts and a matter for the police in relation to the courts, but she is telling the House that there's a grave and exceptional terrorist incident.
But do you not feel that the safeguards that the government has put in place are not going to be sufficient in order to guarantee that constitutional settlement?
No, I think the safeguards are sufficient. I believe the safeguards, by the way, for the individual are sufficient, because the worry had been, when we put forward the proposal for up to 90 days, that essentially people were arguing that you would put someone in the cell and throw the keys away. That is not the case. In the case of going beyond 28 days, not only has the action to be approved by the Director of Public Prosecutions and by the police, but there has to be an independent legal opinion put before the House of Commons. She has to inform the Chairman of the Human Rights Committee and yourself as Chairman of the Home Affairs Committee and the Intelligence and Security Committee. She has to come before the House, obviously, and get the approval of the House for nominating this incident as exceptional and grave. At the same time, the independent reviewer is brought into play. He has got to look at the individual case, not generally report on the work of this Act. And
yes,
every 7 days, that person has to come before a judge. So the protection for the individual is there. The Home Secretary will be very careful not to go beyond what is stated in the Act.
Liberty have made it very clear, and they were in discussions with you during the progress of the legislation, that they feel that the compensation arrangements announced by the Home Secretary are totally unworkable. Are they legally sound?
Well, the Home Secretary has said she will bring before the House proposals about compensation. You've got to remember that the argument that we had with the organisation Liberty was that they wished to use the Civil Contingencies Act in these circumstances.
But with hindsight,
and they would have wanted us to come before the House and declare what was effectively a state of emergency that gave the powers far greater than we were asking for in the Anti-Terrorism Act. These powers would have included preventative detention as well as the detention that we're talking about. And these powers, in my view, would have given the oxygen of publicity to terrorists so that an individual terrorist incident would be leading to effectively a state of emergency in a way that would give massive publicity to a terrorist organisation.
Prime Minister, with hindsight, you're going to amend the Civil Contingency Act anyway with these proposals.
Absolutely.
Why didn't the government, right at the start of this process, decide that that was the best way forward to amend the Civil Contingency Act, rather than to bring these other proposals forward?
Because, if I may say, the Civil Contingencies Act contains a whole range of other powers and a whole range of other circumstances in which the civil contingencies measures can be triggered. We were dealing specifically with terrorism and only terrorism. We were dealing not simply with a terrorist incident, but with a grave and exceptional set of terrorist incidents. This is a power that will be rarely used, but it was a power that I wanted us to have without having to declare a state of emergency and give the oxygen of publicity to terrorists, and a power that was in place long before we had the sort of terrorist incident that would trigger it. I don't want to have to come to the House and say that a terrorist incident has occurred that is of such a nature
yes.
that we need to trigger greater powers than we have at the moment. To do this in a period of calm, where we could have a reflection on what's happened, was by far the best way of doing it.
We have heard that those arguments put forward, but you put yourself forward quite rightly as the Prime Minister of the whole nation. The fact is that these measures will disproportionately affect members of one community, the Muslim community. Is that not the case?
I don't accept that either. I think the support for these measures in the Muslim communities will be as high as the support in other communities, and the reason is that they too want protection against both terrorist incidents and the action of individual terrorists. And I believe, I don't usually go through these things, but I believe from what I can see there is a large amount of support right across the nation for these proposals. And I was actually sorry that we could not achieve an all-party consensus on these proposals. I tried very hard to get that consensus, and so did the Home Secretary. We approached the other parties, we talked to organisations like Liberty, and in my view, what separated us was not sufficient to have justified the major attempt to destroy the legislation.
You only got your legislation through by 9 votes. is it the case that you authorised or offered any backbench member of Parliament a peerage or a knighthood or an honour, even the governorship of Bermuda, in order to vote for your legislation?
Not at all. Nor do I recall sending any letters to anyone.
What about the Ulster Unionists? Did you offer them anything?
I think the criticism of the DUP has been totally misplaced. If there is any party in the House of Commons that knows what terrorism can do and what is its impact on our society, it is the Ulster Unionists. And many members of that party have suffered themselves or their families at the hands of terrorism. And I think those parties that are criticising the DUP should instead be listening to what they say about how terrorism can cause such damaging and deleterious effects.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
I'm sure that will strike a chord in Northern Ireland, Prime Minister. Now, last year, when in those giddy days in June you were forming your Ministry of All the Talents, you decided Parliament didn't quite have everybody you wanted, and so you looked outside. Those appointments that you made, Lord Digby Jones, Lord West, etc., how have they worked out? What's your report on their year's progress?
I think the performance of these ministers has been excellent, and I think they've done a very good job for the country. Digby Jones, of course, spends a great deal of time going around the world making sure that our trade relations with so many of the countries with whom we want to have good relations are indeed very good. Admiral West is doing an excellent job in security. Mark Mallet-Brown is just back from the work that he's done with the African Union in trying to make sure that we have a better outcome in Zimbabwe, and has been much involved in what is happening in Burma. And I think people have seen the benefits of Lord Darcy's report only in the last few days.
So 3 cheers for the House of Lords.
I think those people who can be brought into the government to support the executive responsibilities that governments have got to discharge and can bring a wealth of experience from the outside world are to be welcomed.
Couldn't agree more, and therefore isn't it a good thing that you've got somewhere to put them?
That is the position at the moment.
Yes. Well,
but there are other ways, of course, by which you can add to your government.
As that is the position at the moment, and as any, I don't want to get bogged down in whether we should finally have an elected House or anything like that, but as for the foreseeable future, Prime Minister, even Mr. Straw would agree that we have what we have. Wouldn't it make sense to deal with some of the anomalies at that end of the corridor? What about, I raised this with you before, and you gave a half-hearted reception to we didn't totally dismiss it. What about dealing with the things in Lord Steele's bill, bringing to an end the absurd by-elections for hereditary peers? What about having a statutory appointments commission, which would fit in well with the other things you boasted about earlier today? What about these things? Why not give this bill a fair win next session?
Well, there are proposals about to come from the government to honour the promise that we made when the House of Commons voted on the reform of the House of Lords. And some of the things that you mentioned will be part of these proposals. I don't think it's for me to presume what is going to be published quite soon. But we are aware of both the Steele proposals about the statutory appointments and about by-elections and so on. But we're also aware that we've got to honour our promise to the House of Commons that we'll bring forward proposals about the reform of the House of Lords based on the decisions and the votes of the House of Commons at the time.
But you do know, of course, don't you, that when those votes took place, a majority of your own party voted against 80-20, a majority of the Conservative Parliamentary Party voted against 80-20, and what gave a good majority for the 100% elected was the tactical vote of the Labour members who wanted to throw a spanner in the works and didn't want any elected members at all. So, and you know that to be the case as well as I do. So, building this white paper on this fiction is a bit daft, isn't it?
I don't think so. We've got to honour the promise that we made at the time. There's going to be a lengthy debate about the future of the House of Lords. There always has been. We did say we'd bring forward proposals in our election manifesto. Let's see what these proposals lead to in terms of the debate that takes place in the country. I'm aware that there are immediate issues that might be able to be addressed, but I'm also aware that we've got a responsibility to honour the votes of the House of Commons.
May I bring in Dr. Tony Wright, please?
Thank you very much. I am one of those who does welcome the Constitutional Renewal Bill, not least because some of us were involved in some of the ingredients of it. But could I follow Sir Patrick and just ask about the House of Lords? I've devoted more time than is good for me thinking about House of Lords reform. And, when I hear again that we're going to do this after the next election on the basis of consensus, I have great doubts about it. And what I do know is that there are things that we could do now. We issued a report after the Cashful Peerages affair saying there are things we could do now. You do it without legislation, just to clean up the place. After 10 years of progressive government, we've still got a raft of hereditary peers there. Why don't we just do the cleaning up and at least do what we can do now?
Well, I've said before that the House of Lords should be both accountable and it should not remove the primacy of the House of Commons in so many different areas. As far as these individual changes that you're talking about are concerned, I think we've got to wait till we put forward our proposals in the next period of time, and then let's have the debate about what we can and what we can't do immediately to make sure that the democratic process works better. I have a great deal of sympathy with your proposal about the hereditary peers, but let's see how we can move these things forward. As you know, the reason why people talk about consensus is that proposals are normally to get through both the House of Commons and the House of Lords.
Your predecessor wasn't keen on elections to the Lords. He was in favour of an appointed House. I don't quite understand what your sense of the balance between election and appointment should be. Well,
as you may know, I voted for the 80% myself. I think there are very good arguments in the modern world for those chambers that have responsibility for legislation and the ultimate power with the House of Commons to decide what is legislated in our country and to have a very substantial elected element. But I'm also aware that we have got to deal with this other issue, and that is that the House of Commons, in my view, should have primacy.
But people quite like the idea of a cross-party, non-party element in the House of Lords, don't they?
Yes, but I think you'll find that the House of Lords can be pretty political as well.
Okay. Let me ask a couple of other different things. There's a lot of talk at the moment about the English question.
Yeah.
Do you think there is an English question?
I think you're dealing with a constitution in the United Kingdom where 85% of the population, 85% of the representations in your House of Commons, the representatives, are from one country, England. So the pressure in recent years has been for special arrangements that can guarantee the position of the minorities. That's why the pressure for devolution arose in Scotland and then in Wales, and that's why, of course, for really 90 years we've tried to find the best way of governing in a democratic way in Northern Ireland. So in a constitution where 85% of the population come from one country, and a very small number, 8 or 9% from another, 5 from another, 3 from another. The pressure has always been, I think, in recent years to find a position that would protect, reflect, and give attention to the rights of the minorities. Now, of course, we've got devolution in Scotland, we've got a Scottish Parliament, we've got devolution in Wales, there's a Welsh Assembly. Devolution is working in Northern Ireland with, of course, as you will know, the policing and justice issues still to be dealt with in a second stage of devolution, but it has been working, and I think people see it as a success. So people will then look at, well, what is the position of those people in England in a United Kingdom Parliament? Now, one of the ways that we've sought to deal with that issue is to enhance the power of the regions of England, and therefore you have the proposals you've got regional ministers now, which we haven't got before, and these proposals for regional committees in the House of Commons that will give greater voice to the English regions, particularly so when you have regional offices of government. As far as the issue of voting in the House of Commons itself on what is seen as English legislation, now, first of all, a lot of the legislation that is seen to be simply English has repercussions for the rest of the United Kingdom, so that has got to be understood. Secondly, an English votes for English laws would, in my view, in the end, split the United Kingdom. It would divide the United Kingdom fundamentally. So if we're looking for better solutions for the future, having recognised the rights of the minorities, having seen that there are issues affecting England, I think we've got to look for solutions in a way that is not along what is the headline, English votes for English laws. I think that would inevitably lead for the executive to have to draw its power from both the United Kingdom representatives and from the English representatives, and that would be an unstable situation.
Okay,
and I think you probably agree with that.
Yeah, well, I would have hoped you would have said that we might take some serious look at the governance of England after devolution to see what devolution now means for England. And I'd urge you to do that. Can I just ask one final question? The time is running out. We just had the new equality bill, which again I think we all welcome. But it seems, you mentioned the royal prerogative earlier on, it seems to have an exemption for the royal family. I mean, we have still a royal family which manages to practice religious discrimination and gender discrimination. And there was some suggestion that this might be covered by the Equality Bill. It doesn't seem to have been.
Well, thank God it's not.
I think you'll find. I think you'll find in relation to these issues, both succession and other related issues, that the support for change has got to be wider than the United Kingdom Parliament for change to actually happen. The Queen is not simply the Queen of the United Kingdom, she's Queen of many of the Commonwealth countries. So I think any changes would have to be discussed at a far wider level than simply the United Kingdom Parliament before you could get agreement to do them.
Well, thank you very much for that, Prime Minister. Could I now bring in Edward Lee, who I know would like to ask a particular question?
I just want to ask a couple of supplementaries arising from what Mr. Vaz asked you and Sir Patrick asked you. Mr. Vaz asked you if any inducements had been given to the asked Democratic Unionists, and you quite correctly enumerated their personal experience of terrorism. But I just want to ask you a direct question. So there were absolutely no discussions about anything with the DUP except the merits or otherwise of the 42-day legislation. You just have to give a yes or no answer.
Yes, and there was a great deal of discussion, including about the security issues.
No, there was no discussion about any other issue apart from the 42 days. You have to say yes or no.
We were discussing the 42 days.
You were only discussing the 42 days?
We were producing security information. That's absolutely right. We were discussing the issue on its merits.
Right.
And I think you do a great disservice to many members of this House of Commons if you suggest otherwise.
Thank you. That's very clear, Prime Minister.
I just want to get that absolutely clear. Thank you. And in relation to what Sir Patrick was asking you about the powers of Parliament, obviously, there's shifting sands of the economy, and we don't know how long you're going to be there. What do you want to leave your legacy in terms of constitutional renewal and the powers of Parliament? I mean, do you think that the powers of this Parliament are relatively weak compared to the executive? I mean, here you're surrounded by chairmen of select committees. Do you think that you would like to move gradually to a system where, for instance, the Defence Committee had the same sort of powers eventually as the Armed Services Committee in Congress? I know it's a long step, but what are your views on this? I mean, this is not trying to sort of...
I want a new settlement. I want a new settlement in Britain where we strengthen the role of the individual citizen. We strengthen the role of the individual citizen through the power that Parliament has to represent their interests. And I feel that by changing the royal prerogative and by making many of the other changes that we're talking about, including a Bill of Rights and Responsibilities and a statement of values, we move our country more thoroughly into the modern world. Now, removing all these areas where the royal prerogative has been exercised in the past is only the first stage. The discussion of the Bill of Rights and Responsibilities is a further stage, and I've always left open the question that this could lead to a discussion in our country of a written constitution at some stage.
I was specifically asking about powers of select committees. I mean, obviously our audit system is very good in this country. The budget, the scrutiny of the budget is weaker, we know that. You've been Chancellor of Exchequer for 10 years. I mean, the Finance Committee has very little time to discuss these amendments. I mean, do you think that we could learn from other jurisdictions about how we could create a more powerful budget committee that actually could look at spending plans, with your experience as Prime Minister?
Well, I think traditionally in Britain, partly because of what happened with the budget in the early years of the 20th century, when the budget was rejected by the House of Lords, the government's ability to get its budget through has been seen as a very major issue about the credibility of the government itself. So the budget in Britain has been seen quite differently from budgets in many other countries. I think the House of Commons itself could do more, and members could do more if they wish to scrutinise both the expenditure and the finance measures of government. And I don't think there's anything preventing the House of Commons taking a bigger interest in these matters. You're chairman of the Public Accounts Committee. We have here the chairman of the Treasury Select Committee. I've always thought that it's possible for more investigations to be done, for more information to be provided. And I've tried to make that possible when I was Chancellor, and will try to make that possible in future. The more information that is out there in the open, the better.
Thank you.
But I just asked Al one more question to ask you.
How can a constitutional renewal bill meet the ambitions which you've quite rightly set for it, despite all the useful things in it, if it doesn't address the centralisation of power, fixed-term parliaments, the electoral system, all of those issues which would, if altered, actually change the real balance between the executive and the legislature?
Well, I think it depends what you think is absolutely crucial to the future of our Constitution. Surely what is crucial to the future of our Constitution is that the individual citizen feels more empowered. And we are bringing forward proposals in the next few weeks with a local government reform that will give the individual citizen far more power to petition, far more power to question, far more powers of recall in relation to many of the issues that affect their lives. And then the second issue is the powers of Parliament itself. I don't think the powers of the House of Commons in particular start and end with whether there's a fixed-term Parliament or whether there is electoral reform. These are two of the issues, but these are not the major issues. I think the changes we're making about the declaration of war, the dissolution of Parliament, the recall of Parliament, the ratification of international treaties, the parliamentary chemo, these are very important issues.
Prime Minister, we do know all that. We're moving to the end of this session. I'd just like to ask you one final question on the Constitution. It's this. There was a little bit of argy-bargy between you and the former leader of the Labour Party in Scotland over whether there should or should not be a referendum and whether it should be brought on or put off. Where do you stand on that?
Well, it turned out that there was no wish on the part of the Scottish Parliament at that time to bring forward a bill for a referendum.
Yeah, but where do you stand?
Well, we've set up the Calman Commission. I don't know if you know the details of that. Professor Calman is chairing a commission that involves...
Yeah, I'm sure he is, but where do you stand?
Hold on. It involves all the major parties. They are looking at the outcome of the devolution arrangements over these past few years in Scotland. They will make a report. If they make far-reaching proposals, we will then have to look at them in the context of what support you have for the public to do so. But I think we should wait until we see the Calman report.
So you're not prepared to give an opinion at the moment?
I think you've got to wait and see whether the Calman report recommends major changes.
Thank you very much.
The original Scottish Parliament was voted through by a referendum of the Scottish people that was organised by the United Kingdom Parliament. But let's wait and see what the Calman proposals suggest.
Thank you very much. I'll hand back to
Thank you, Patrick. We now move to the second theme, global economic issues. Malcolm Bruce.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Prime Minister, the Treasury published a document a couple of weeks ago on commodity prices and their implications. There's one bold statement that says high commodity prices negatively affect the popularity of governments, which gets you something you've experienced. And Prime Minister, you're rather fond of lists, and can I put some lists to you? 40 years ago, the population of the world was 3 billion. It's currently 6.7 billion, and it's predicted to be 9.1 billion by 2050. The World Bank says that we'll need to increase grain production by 50% by 2030, and the International Energy Association says we need to increase oil production by 30.5 billion barrels a day. That's 15 North Seas by 2030. In those circumstances, first of all, is there anything we should be doing to try and level off the world population, or do we just have to accept it as a given? And do you not think in this situation there is a real possibility that in a generation the world could actually run out of oil and food to meet the needs and aspirations of the population of the world?
Well, let's put this in the context. You're absolutely right about the population rises, but in the last 10 years we've had two of the great benefits of globalisation, which have been cheap consumer prices for goods like electronics and clothes. And we've had low interest rates as a result of the low inflation that has come out of low manufacturing prices from China and elsewhere. We're now seeing the two difficulties. That is the massive restructuring that's taking place in the world economy, a shift of power to Asia, obviously happening, and this pressure on resources. Some people have called it resource nationalism. Pressure on food, pressure on oil, pressure on commodities. And I think we have got to deal with these as global problems, that now require global solutions. And although we can do a great deal in the United Kingdom and other countries can do so to deal with the costs of energy or to deal with the problem of food shortages, in the end, these are global problems that require global action. Now, if you take, first of all, food, it's pretty clear to me that there is a food shortage that is the worst for 30 years. It's pretty clear also that we'll need to increase food production. One of the great tragedies of our time is that Africa is a net importer of food when it could actually be a net producer or exporter of food. So at this time, the worst thing we could do is to cut the support to developing countries and preventing them developing their agricultural systems. And we will have to make progress on the removal of the food subsidies in what is a very protected market.
But
on oil, do you want me to finish it?
Well, I was just going to say, Prime Minister, that your document, the Treasury's document, seems to me to say, well, just by applying sort of international cooperation and market forces, we'll bring supply and demand into balance, and that's fine. Do you not accept there's an underlying pressure that cannot ultimately be delivered on an ever-rising scale unless we find other ways to deliver it?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And when I talk about oil, you mentioned the IEA's proposals about oil. I think it is reducing our dependence on oil that makes the environmental imperative about climate change come together with an economic imperative, which is that we must reduce the world's dependence on this one fuel, or oil and gas, if we put them both together. And in Britain's case, we will soon be 80% dependent for gas imports on other countries, and that is not a situation we want to be in. So it is ultimately a decision about, first of all, nuclear power, secondly, about renewables and how we can expand renewables, and thirdly, about greater energy efficiency. And the agenda, which is an economic as well as environmental agenda for the world, is now very clear indeed. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reduce our dependence on oil, and we will have to take big strategic decisions, and these include decisions that other countries as well as us, because we've made these decisions about nuclear energy, other countries as well as us have got to make decisions about the stimulation of renewables. We will soon become the world's biggest offshore wind producer as a result of the decisions that we've made in the North Sea. And we'll have to make decisions about energy efficiency, and that's about cars, and it's about the efficiency of the use of energy in households. Now, these are three major changes that arise from what we see both around the world and the rising oil price itself.
Well, I mean, we had a once-in-a-generation opportunity to get out of oil dependency in the 1970s, and we didn't do it.
We did reduce our dependence on oil, but not sufficiently. And there are signs in America and in Europe that the usage of oil will be reduced, but we're dealing with a massive expansion in demand for oil from China, from India, and from Asia. I mean, China's got about 37 million cars at the moment. Every year, another 10 or so million cars are being bought for Chinese roads. They're building 100 airports at the moment. They're building 1,000 cities. So the demand for oil from them and from the oil producers, because a very substantial amount of the oil that is being produced at the moment is being consumed with subsidies in either China or India or in the oil-producing countries. And it's one of the most protected markets, and it has got to be opened up.
Well, can I move you on to food then? Because one of the reasons why food prices is rising is the rising living standards of, for example, the Chinese and the Indians, that they're actually having a better diet. Yet,
which is itself a good thing.
Well, that's a good thing, but Bob Selleck, the president of the World Bank, has stated that the increase in food prices has put between 73 and 105 million people back into poverty this year, wiping out all of the aid and development that the world has delivered over the last 7 years. So isn't the reality that the rising living standards of the Chinese and the Indians is actually increasing poverty in other parts of the world?
And that is why I will go to the G8 with a proposal that we increase the support for agricultural production in developing countries. That all the G8 and other countries are prepared to help the Africans particularly, but other countries invest in increasing both the production and the productivity of their agriculture, where of course the ability to use fertilizers and other means by which productivity is improved has been limited. In other words, we need a new green revolution in the developing countries to enable them to produce what they will need for the future. But that will cost money, and I think it's important to recognize that this would be the wrong time to cut aid to developing countries, even although we are in difficult circumstances ourselves, and so are the other industrialized countries because of the rise of oil and food prices. it would be in the short term and long term a huge mistake to cut that aid.
You know I would agree with you on that, Prime Minister. Michael Connors.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Prime Minister. Can I turn to international organisations, which I know you've been very, very involved in trying to direct and encourage over the last period, but specifically for the EU. I mean, I just wonder what, in reality, not philosophically, but in reality, in terms of action, what the UK expect the European Union to do. It does appear to me, I mean, it's been said that the people of the developed world complain when food prices rise, but the people of the poor countries of the world starve. But we seem to have in the EU a greedy, selfish club in the reactions that have come recently to the limited efforts made by the Trade Commissioner to reorganise the arrangements worldwide. There's criticism from aid organisations about the limited changes to the ACP arrangements. What we've had is a reaction from the EU of selfishness. Can we really look for anything from the EU other than protectionism, this new economic patriotism it's called, in the face of what are internationally devastating changes to food prices?
I'm happy to join you in the criticism of the Common Agricultural Policy, which we, with some of the countries, want to change fundamentally. But I don't think you should fail to recognise that the European Union is the world's leader in development aid, not selfish, but the leader in development aid, that we are the leader in climate change reform, pressing the rest of the world to take the action that is necessary for a sustainable environment.
In the last year.
In the last year. And the European Union is also leading in seeking a trade deal. The problems of the trade deal are not those created by the European Union, which is prepared to reduce its tariffs, but we must persuade the other continents to take the action that is commensurate with it. And so at the moment we need to get a deal with the Brazilians and with the South American and Latin American group of countries about the aid that they give to manufacturing industry. We need to cement what are the proposals from the Americans about reducing agricultural subsidies. And of course we need to be sure that we are helping the developing countries, because it is a development round that we are proposing for trade. Now, I've said we're a few minutes before midnight. If we can't get a trade deal in the next few weeks, I think it may elude us for many, many months, if not longer. And it may indeed be a trade deal that, if we cannot get, suggests that these multilateral trade deals are not going to be easy at all to get in the future. So there is a great responsibility on the shoulders of the G8 when it meets next week. There are then the ministerial talks that are taking place on July the 21st, organised by the World Trade Negotiator Pascal Lamy. And I think we have got to show, in a world that is becoming increasingly protectionist, as you rightly say, that we are capable of standing up to that and showing that the world is, on a multilateral basis, capable of reaching an agreement on trade.
Unfortunately, my understanding and perception of the EU over the last 10 years is we failed to do that. We failed to get the CAP properly reformed and, in fact, abolished. And it's very difficult to go elsewhere and say you should bring down your trade barriers when, in fact, we have clearly done a deal that leaves them in place within the EU. Can I move on specifically to...
Can I just say on that very briefly that the European Union is offering to reduce its tariffs very substantially indeed. And I think that the European Union has shown itself willing to agree a trade deal, and we must get that trade deal over the next few weeks.
And for doing so, you get attacked by the French President.
I think it's important to recognise that the EU negotiating position is held by, is one that the whole European Union has supported.
Can I just press you on that? I mean, it does seem that everyone's looking for populist selfishness to get votes. And it worries me that, in fact, we're not willing to take on the big issues and say we really have to do something unique in the developed country, particularly in the EU, half a billion people who are quite well off compared with this world. Particularly in our very advanced economies, we don't seem to be willing to do that because it's all about the voting cycle.
The worst thing that could happen in this particular period is that the world resorts to an old form of protectionism. And there is a danger, yes, of protectionist sentiment rising. It's rising because people can see the losses from globalisation and are not appreciating the gains. People see their jobs being lost as a result of big transfer of manufacturing strength, in which about 1 million jobs a year are going from America, Europe and Japan to the developing and emerging market economies. and people are therefore worried about this cost of living. What they're not appreciating, of course, is that they're able to buy cheaper consumer goods as a result of that, that our economies are capable of adapting and developing high value-added goods and services, that we are actually capable of competing in an open global economy. But it's got to be an inclusive economy. In other words, we've got to make sure that we take care of the needs of people who are being forced to make big changes.
Turning specifically just to biofuels in the EU, the recommendation of the European Environment Agency Scientific Committee is that the 10% target which has been set should be abandoned, in fact, because of its effect on food prices. Do you think the UK should be pushing the EU to focus on sustainable biofuels, for example, using sugar, rather than the general biofuels policy it has at the moment?
Well, I think this debate has veered from over-optimistic predictions about what biofuels can achieve, and now very pessimistic views of the damage that biofuels are doing to basic food production without actually making for better environmentally sensitive products. I think probably in the end we'll get to a better equilibrium in this debate, that there are good biofuels and there are bad biofuels, which is the implication of your question. We will be publishing very soon the report that has been done, the Gallagher report, on biofuels. We've looked at the scientific evidence, or the review has looked at it very carefully. It will make its recommendations, and on that basis we will approach the European Union with our proposals for any changes that are necessary in policy. I think it's really important, as your question implies, to look at the scientific evidence.
Can I turn to the wider economic institutions that would be referred generally as the Bretton Woods institutions? When I've been in discussion with people who are interested in development aid and growth, they say the World Bank, the IMF, and the body which later became the World Trade Organization, they were established in 1944. Are they equipped really to deal with the commodity price problems and the changes in the world that we now face, or do we need a new Bretton Woods, which has been talked about in the context of the 21st century? Well,
I think you're absolutely right. We're part of a group of the Commonwealth countries, as well part of a discussion in the European Union about major reform of the international institutions. I think we found with the financial crisis, the credit crunch, that we've got no proper early warning system about issues of financial stability for the world economy. We've got the Financial Stability Forum, which we actually played a part in setting up, but I think the International Monetary Fund, which used to deal with balance of payments crises that countries had in what were basically sheltered economies, has got to change for the new global economy. So we need that early warning system. We need to be better at dealing with issues of financial stability at a global level. You have national regulators, but you have global capital markets you need to change. I think the World Bank has got to change fundamentally. It's got to be able to deal not just with the problems of poverty, but the problems of the environment and climate change. And if we are to get an agreement at Copenhagen on climate change, which would cut emissions substantially, then there is no way that the poorest countries in the world, the emerging markets or the developing countries in the world, can finance the climate changes that are needed without substantial injections of finance, whether in loan finance or grant finance. And you will need a body with the size and capacity of the World Bank to be able to guarantee that there are flows of money for the investment needed in alternative sources of energy. And I also think, as far as the United Nations are concerned, that we will see over time, whether it be Burma or Zimbabwe, or before that Darfur or Rwanda, or countries in the eastern part of Europe around the breakup of Yugoslavia, we will need better ways of establishing stability, reconstruction, as well as peacekeeping and humanitarian aid. And we do not have the international organisations that can help us by moving into countries on request with civil society as well as military people that can help reconstruct these societies when they are failed states or failing states.
Prime Minister, I wonder if you could turn to the domestic impact of rising fuel prices.
Yes, Prime Minister, I was very glad to hear you say earlier on that when we're not at the mercy of world events entirely when it comes to energy. You said we can do a great deal in the UK to deal with rising energy prices. Let's look at what the British government can do in respect of energy, security, cleanliness and affordability. The first thing we could probably do is make sure that the European markets were properly liberalised. I know there's been progress in respect of electricity, but the wholesale gas market is still a scandal. Shouldn't you be spending your time persuading our European colleagues to liberalise their gas markets rather than giving lectures to the King of Saudi Arabia about how you should invest his money?
Well, I wasn't actually giving lectures to anybody about how they should invest the money. I'm trying to find a way that instead of a conflict of interest between oil producers and oil consumers, we can find where there is common interest in us working together to reduce our dependence on oil. And you're absolutely right that we want to see greater progress in the liberalisation of gas, electricity and energy markets in Europe. There was progress made at the June European Council, but there is a lot more to do, and the single market has over time to become a reality in all areas.
But we've been saying this for years, Prime Minister, and there is progress on electricity.
There is progress.
But wholesale gas markets in Europe are still desperately illiquid. That has huge consequences for British consumers, domestic and industrial.
Yes, and one of the things that we have tried to do, of course, is to increase competition in these markets. But at the same time, I'm telling you today that we want to reduce our dependence on oil and gas, and there are ways that we can make domestic decisions about nuclear energy and renewables to do so. And that's where the environmental agenda and the economic imperatives of our times come together.
Well, I agree with you about that, and that's what I want to ask you next, in fact. I think the 2003 white paper on energy was really disappointing. It relegated nuclear power to 2 paragraphs. Mm-hmm. It said very little about carbon capture and storage, and virtually nothing like gas storage. And so that means that here we are 5 years on, we're still talking about building nuclear power stations, and actually we're not much further forward.
I don't accept that.
Well, 5 years on, and we still haven't got any sign of a starting work.
I don't accept that. Look, the issue is, first of all, are we going to replace existing nuclear power stations as they themselves reach the end of their life? And that is a decision that we've made. Secondly, will we need to do more? That is a decision that we're looking at. And I just got to say that we are leading the debate around the world about the expansion of nuclear energy. 16 out of 27 of the European countries are now either expanding their existing nuclear energy or considering it, or considering having nuclear power for the first time. So we are leading this debate and will continue to do so.
But if we had been there 5 years ago, as we could and should have been, we wouldn't be where we are now. We wouldn't be facing loss of electricity supplies in a few years' time, and we wouldn't be facing competition for the skills and resources to build those new nuclear power stations.
I just don't accept that. I think the right time to make decisions about nuclear power is as we look to replace existing nuclear power stations. And of course there is a debate now about whether we should go even further than that, and whether we should have more of our electricity supplied by nuclear. But I think we've actually led the world. I mean, other countries still have not followed. As Italy announced a few weeks ago it was going to do something about nuclear. We've been debating this and making decisions on this in the last few months. And I may say, over the last year, not with all-party support, I may say, not with all-party support, we have made a decision on nuclear. We've made a decision on the planning system that will allow us to speed up the development of these new energy sources, and we've made big decisions also about housing and big decisions about infrastructure. So we are trying to make the long-term decisions that are essential for our country.
You will understand I don't accept your point about all-party support. I think my party's policies on nuclear power will deliver nuclear power sooner and more robustly than yours, and I think the planning policies you brought in have sacrificed democracy unnecessarily to achieve an objective we both secure. I think national policy statements on their own would have done it. You don't need the infrastructure planning. Never mind. That's a difference between us.
I just don't accept that. A national policy statement on its own will not deliver the result that is necessary. You will still have 6.5-year planning inquiries or 7-year planning inquiries.
That's just not true, Prime Minister.
We have to have a way of speeding it up.
It's not true. If you look at Sizewell B, it was overwhelmingly dominated with national issues. Take them out, you can address local issues properly. Never mind, let's move on.
Yeah,
gas supplies.
I think it's probably better for you that you do move on.
I think you're on very weak ground there, Prime Minister. What about gas storage? We have a fraction of European gas storage levels, and that means that our industrial consumers in particular suffer very real levels of price volatility as they try to plan their businesses forward.
Well, you probably know, and perhaps it's not really the best time to go into it in detail, that we are discussing very substantial changes in how we can guarantee the supply of gas to this country in future, and there will be announcements made soon.
But again, we knew this was happening 10 years ago. This should have happened much sooner.
Look, the truth is that for the last 30 years, we have had oil and gas from the North Sea. That has provided a very substantial amount of the energy needs of this country. As the North Sea oil and gas runs down, as it is running down, we are making alternative arrangements. We have led the way on nuclear. I just remind you that your party was against nuclear. We have led the way on renewables.
We've never ever been against nuclear
we've
power.
led the way
on
renewables, and we've now published last week our proposals for dealing with the renewables issue. We are now about to become the world leader in the amount of offshore wind power, which is basically using the North Sea, which is used for oil, for wind power as well. So we are moving forward with that agenda, and I agree with you. It is necessary to move quickly on this agenda to reduce our dependence on oil and gas.
Well, we could debate nuclear power at greater length, but we won't now. Let's do one last question. Energy efficiency. quite understandably, you've targeted a lot of your assistance on the vulnerable pensioners who have experienced very real price increases they can't tolerate as a result of rising fuel prices worldwide. But you don't seem to do quite so much for other vulnerable households, particularly those with young disabled people in them, for example. And so, in that context, why are you planning, after years of welcome increases in the budgets for the Warm Front programme, why are you planning over the next 3 years significantly to cut support for the Warm Front programme?
I think you'll find that we've just signed an arrangement with the utility companies that will help exactly the low-income households that you're talking about, particularly those that use meters. Up to now, about £50 million has been made available by the utility companies for this. The arrangement is it rises to 100 million and 150 million, and that is money that will go directly to low-income families. As far as Warm Front and measures to improve the insulation, the draft proofing and the energy efficiency of homes, we are doing more than we used to do, and I think you will find that we will be doing even more after further announcements later.
Well, the announcement you made on the 30th of June, written out, not you personally, the Minister, showed you were cutting the budget over the next 3 years. That's the 30th of June, the parliamentary answer I have here. So that answer is inaccurate, isn't it?
I think you'll find that in times like this, where the need for greater energy efficiency through insulation and draft proofing can both save energy and cut the bills of households, there will be further measures that will be announced soon.
Thank you.
Just before we move on to the effect on transport, you mentioned the North Sea, Prime Minister. Not only did you go to Saudi Arabia and encourage them to increase production, you met oil companies in Aberdeenshire to have a similar discussion. We're currently still 90% self-sufficient in oil and 70% self-sufficient in gas. And the estimate is there's probably as much more oil to be got out of the North Sea as we've yet produced. So can you tell us what you're prepared to do to ensure that we maximise the production from our own resources for oil and gas in the UK? And if I may make a local point, that what you will do to support the infrastructure on the ground that is necessary to enable the companies to deliver that degree of extra oil and gas resources from the UK rather than from Saudi Arabia.
It is true to say that some estimates suggest we've only taken half the oil from the North Sea that is available, and therefore there's a considerable amount of resource there. The difficulty is we're moving to a new stage of exploration and development, that you're dealing with small fields, you're dealing with difficult to recover oil, and you're dealing with the West Shetlands. So there's three specific types of problem that are got to be dealt with. That's why we're looking at the incentives for exploration and development, and we'll bring forward proposals if we think it's right to do so. And that's why the activity in the North Sea has tended to move from the big majors to smaller companies who are more willing to spend their energies developing particular fields that are more difficult for extraction
and, the ones
and,
who could
and
do
demand special expertise.
Tax changes that you've imposed upon
well, we
the
have given, as you know, special tax incentives for exploration for these particular types of companies, and we'll look at what we can do. There is this other issue about existing fields where we've only extracted about 40 or 50% of the oil, but it is harder to get to the rest of the oil, and we're going to look at that as well. So these are the three problems: small fields, hard to extract oil in big fields, and the West Shetland activity, and we're looking at all of these things.
Louise Elman.
The price of oil has now reached over $145 a barrel. Petrol's 118.9p per litre, and diesel, the second highest in Europe, is 132.3p per litre. What specific work have you commissioned to look at the impact of these ever-rising prices on the economy and on businesses?
Well, we've not only looked at the impact, but we have, for the time being, frozen petrol duty.
No, I'm asking you, what work have you commissioned to look at the impact of this on businesses and on the economy?
Well, we're looking at that every day. When you look at the effect that the price of oil has on other consumer spending, when you look at the effect that the price of gas and electricity has on the household bill, and then, of course, when you look at the effect it has on industry generally. These are studies that we're doing every day, and rightly so. But I was answering by what we've actually tried to do to alleviate some of the problems. We've frozen petrol duty most years since 2000, and we froze it in the budget.
I want to know where you're identifying the specific problems that have arisen from the situation and then how you're addressing them. What
if you're asking,
to look at the specific areas, not what you've done in the past,
but if
or what you've not done in the past.
But if you're
where
asking,
are the problems now?
But if you're asking me about the source of these problems, it's essentially that demand exceeds supply. I mean, that is the essential problem that has got to be dealt with in a rising population and, of course, the rising prosperity of some people in different parts of the world like Asia. If demand exceeds supply and is likely to exceed supply for years to come, then people will expect the oil price to rise.
What I want you to answer, Prime Minister, is where are the specific problems in the economy here now? Which particular groups of people are being affected the most, and what are you going to do about it?
Well, obviously, those people who are households on the lowest incomes are hit most. When food and energy are a very high proportion of the money that they have to spend, and that's why we've taken action with the winter allowance to raise it yet again for elderly people. That's why I was referring to the deal that we've done with the utility companies, that they will give more help to low-income households, especially those who are paying higher costs for their energy than many other people because of the way that they consume energy. And we are always determined to do what we can to help those who might be people who suffer from fuel poverty.
So this is something that you're looking at all the time?
Indeed, and we'll continue to do so. And if we can take measures that will help people cut their energy bills by using energy more efficiently, or finding a way that we can help them cut the consumption of energy, we will do so.
One of the key questions for the moment, of course, is whether you're going to increase fuel tax duty, as you said you will. Now, the Treasury are saying that the matter will be considered in the autumn, and a decision will be taken based on economic and social factors. What are those factors?
Well, I think exactly the same factors that have led us to previous decisions. You've got to be conscious of what's happening to the oil price itself. What then is the effect on the cost of diesel and petrol, and the impact that is going to have on the economy as a whole. And I think you'll find that in most years since 2000 that the duty has actually been frozen.
And in view of what you know now, are you going to increase fuel duty, or is it better that you say now that you're not going to?
Well, I can say now that's a decision for the Chancellor, and he will make his decision.
Are you
in due course.
seriously saying, Prime Minister, that the Chancellor will take that decision in isolation from the Prime Minister?
Not at all. That the Chancellor will take the decision looking at all these factors that I've just told you are borne in mind. And I think it's right, having frozen duty in April, that he has time to review the situation and then make his announcement before the time at which duty would go
up.
And
based on what you know now, will you be putting that 2p increase?
I'm not going to make a forecast, but it is clearly a matter that will be looked at very, very carefully over the next few weeks.
And the government have said that the policy on fuel taxes is to do with addressing the external costs of pollution and to fund public services. Is that still the government's policy?
One of the problems about the whole energy market around the world is the subsidies in China, Asia, and in the oil-producing countries. So you have a very unbalanced market where people can buy oil without knowing the real cost of it economically. We also have to take into account the cost to the environment. And that is one of the reasons why successive governments have wanted to look at the cost of fuel in relation to its effect on the environment.
Is what you said at the time of the budget, that fuel taxes are to be based on the external costs of pollution and to fund public services, still government policy in the light of current developments and current public concern?
Well, of course, these are part of these are some of the issues that will be taken into account when the decision is made. And it's right to look at the effect of oil consumption on pollution, and it's also right to look at the balance of taxes as they affect our ability to provide public services.
One of the other concerns is to do with the increasing numbers of continental vehicles, haulage vehicles, coming into the UK. And according to the Freight Transport Association, the costs of foreign lorries working in the UK are actually 10 to 15% less than UK-based operators working in the UK. Now, decisions have been taken in Europe which mean there will be increasing numbers of continental hauliers working in this country. In view of that, why did the government state that they were not going to go ahead with the Vignette scheme so that those hauliers could help to pay for the costs of using the roads here?
The problem about that scheme is that the capital costs of introducing the new proposals was so great that it would have cost us more to introduce the proposals than it would have in the amount of money it raised. As far as continental producers are concerned, continental hauliers are concerned, I think you've also got to look that there are higher VAT rates in these countries, there are higher social insurance payments in these countries, and there are higher taxes in these countries. So I think you've got to balance that off against the cost of fuel.
So when the Freight Transport Association make the statement, are you saying that that's wrong?
We've had lengthy discussions over time, and there has been previously a transport forum when these issues are looked at, and I would very much like for the transport department to have talks with those people concerned about the freight industry and hauliers generally. But I think you'll find that the continental costs of operating, particularly from many of the countries from which they come, are in VAT, social insurance and general taxation higher than they are in Britain, and that is balanced off against the cost of fuel.
When you say that the study that the Transport Department commissioned, Department for Transport commissioned onto introducing a Vignette scheme in relation to lorries would cost more than the amount of money it would save.
Well, it would take a very long time for it.
Over what time scale?
Well, it would take a very long time for it to pay back the costs of the initial investment in it.
How long?
Well, I can't remember the exact details. I dealt with that when I was in the Treasury about two years ago, if I remember right. And I'm very happy to send the committee the figures, but it was a very expensive capital cost to introduce the scheme in the first place.
But in view of the current situation and the current disquiet, don't you feel that's something that you should revisit?
Well, it's obviously things that we would continue to look at, but I think we have got to be aware of the very big costs of introducing the scheme in the first place.
But don't you think you should look at the benefits and of the anger that there is now by the absence of a scheme or an equivalent? And if you're not going to have such a scheme, why isn't there something else?
Well, I think there has been discussion on other possibilities, and I do say that the debate and the dialogue between the freight industry, the hauliers, and the government about these issues should continue, and I'd be very happy to make sure that it's expedited.
Can I just bring Michael Carty in for a final supplementary?
One thing that hasn't been covered, Prime Minister, when I was at last meeting with the members of the UK oil and gas industry, their Chief Executive said that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are sitting on a big fat windfall from production tax from the North Sea. Why is it not going to be used to relieve some of the problems that you've been discussing in the last 30 minutes?
I was trying to explain yesterday in the House of Commons that is essentially when you have higher costs for oil, it is true that if you have North Sea production delivering oil and you tax it, that there is additional revenue, although production in the North Sea has not been increasing. But that is offset by when oil prices are high, people spend less on other things, and therefore VAT revenues go down. People spend less on property as a result of some of the things that are happening in the economy, and your stamp duty receipts go down. And people companies tend, with a few exceptions, to make less profits, and therefore your corporate tax receipts go down. So the effect of a rise in the price of oil is that it affects the rest of the economy in such a way that you usually have lower receipts overall than you have higher receipts, and that is the impact of high oil prices.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You can see that oil and food prices are not going to go away, and your political challenges will intensify. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We now move on to managing the economic slowdown. John McFall.
On the theme of oil, Prime Minister, can I add to that? It is reported that both presidential candidates in the US say that action is needed to rein in speculators in the oil market. If so, what action are you taking? I'm reminded of what Joe Lieberman said when he said a significant contributing factor to the economic distress now being felt by American consumers every time they stand in the grocery store checkout line or pay for a fill-up at the gas pump Lieberman is very close to McCain, and Obama has also made these points. What are you going to do about the speculators?
Well, we are looking at this. The Treasury is looking at this. The Financial Services Authority is looking at this, just as the US authorities are looking at it, and the European Union. And so if there were any market manipulation, it would be exposed, and we would take action.
But, Chancellor, the Financial Services Authority, I haven't looked at it yet. I had Adair Turner before my committee yesterday, the incoming chairman of that, and I pointed out to him that the Americans are saying at the moment there's a London loophole in the oil futures market trading and artificially boosting prices. And indeed, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the chief futures regulator, imposed limits in the US last week on the size of speculative positions that could be taken on the London futures market. So there is a real problem here. I'm going to have an inquiry in a couple of weeks, one session on that. But we really need some action, because it's reported that there's $260 billion of speculative money in the oil futures market.
I have looked at that, and I know what you're talking about, and that there are these inquiries going on. But I would say to you that in an oil market where demand exceeds supply today, tomorrow, and people expect it to exceed supply next year and a few years afterwards, that is the primary reason why the price is going up. And we've got to have measures that both make more efficient the use of oil itself, so that you can actually reduce consumption where it is possible to do so, and increase supply from other sources by reducing the dependence on oil. So you cannot put down to speculation the whole of the problem that we're dealing with at the moment. There is greater demand than there is supply.
I understand.
And that is why we've got to take economic action to deal with that.
Let me take an example. You went to Saudi Arabia and they increased their output, but the next day the price of oil went up. So to the ordinary person, perception, well, what's the score here?
Well, what happened on that particular day was that the Nigerian oil production was interrupted by violence, and I think they lost 10% of their oil production. So you're dealing with difficult oil production places around the world. In this case, Nigeria, but it could be any other place where something is happening that has gone wrong. The real problem that we've got to deal with, and this is why the debate is bigger than simply about oil, the real problem we've got to deal with is that in the foreseeable future, demand will exceed supply unless we can take very big measures to deal both with our dependence on oil and with the efficient use of oil. And that's why I say that we've got to deal with the nuclear issue, we've got to deal with the renewables issue, and we've got to deal with, if you like, making the use of oil more efficient by the way we deal with the future production of cars, as well as household consumption.
I understand that, but underlying my questions is a theme of fairness here, and the ordinary person will think, well, what's fair about this? We've got to get, if the market's there, it's got to work properly, and it doesn't seem to me as if it's working properly on that. But on the issue of fairness,
the oil market, if I may say so, doesn't work properly. First of all, because you've got an organisation called OPEC, which actually tries to set the production limits on oil. And it's one of the most sheltered markets in the world. And it's a great irony that the two areas where we've got the greatest inflation, food and oil, are the two biggest protected markets in the world, where we need demand and supply to work better.
Prime Minister, what I would say to that then is, if that's the case, let's try and do something about it and be seen to be doing something about it. That's the issue here. And in talking on fairness, both you and the Chancellor have stressed continued wage restraint on pay from both the public and the private sector. But yet, in the private sector in the past few weeks, we've seen the Shell tanker drivers having a 2-year 14% 2-year settlement. Babcock's Engineering, for example, had 7.6% for its 500 workers, and Barclays Bank announced a 5% increase for its 55,000 employees as the first leg of a 3-year RPI deal. What, realistically, can you do to ensure that wage restraint in the private sector is held back beyond making more speeches?
Well, I just say that we have now signed 3-year public sector pay deals with nearly 1.75 million public sector workers. The teachers at 2.45, 2.3, 2.3. The nurses at figures that are just around that, doctors at 2.2%, workers in the Inland Revenue, workers in the Department of Work and Pensions. So we have nearly 2 million workers covered by 3-year pay deals. And if I may say so, I hope that members of Parliament today will recognise that the settlements in the public sector for these key workers have been around 2.3, 2.4 and 2.5 when they vote on this year's pay when the House of Commons votes this afternoon.
Okay, on that
as far as private sector pay is concerned, just to answer your question, total earnings growth in the public sector and the private sector is roughly the same. It's about 3.8% at the moment. And I think it is a very important thing to remember that in Britain, historically, we had a huge inflation problem because of two parts of it. One is we allowed inflation too easily to creep back into the system domestically. And secondly, we then had on top of that the wages spiral. And that actually gave Britain the big inflation problem we had in the past. It's very much in the interest of everybody in the country that we avoid what is an internationally generated problem of inflation. Everybody knows it comes from oil prices and food prices around the world. We avoid it becoming also a wages problem in the future, and that's why we're taking the action that we're doing.
Chancellor, I'll come on to that inflation thing in a minute. But on this issue of the public sector, I mean, Brendan Barber has stated just recently that asking low-paid and average earners in the private or public sector jobs to make sacrifices when there's little sign of restraint from those at the top who continue to enjoy lavish bonuses. He was talking about the city bonuses, and the ONS statistics show that in 2005 it was 5 billion. Last year, even though we've got this credit crunch, it was almost 14 billion. Surely that breaches any test of fairness, and Brendan Barber has got a real serious point here to make.
Well, there's got to be restraint in the private sector as well, and there's got to be fairness at the top as well as at the low-paid end of the spectrum. We have in our public sector pay settlements, particularly the nurses and health service settlement, given more money to the low-paid, so they have a higher level of earnings. We have in the Army, for example, given the lowest paid last year, a 9% pay rise. So we are trying, both with the minimum wage rising and with help to particular groups of low-paid workers, to do more. And the tax credit was specifically introduced to help low-paid workers get a minimum income guarantee and not just a minimum wage guarantee. But you're right that at the top of British business, people have got to accept their responsibilities as well, that in the interests of the country we've got to keep inflation low.
Yeah, but we need not just words but actions, Prime Minister, and it doesn't seem as if that's particularly happening at the moment. And you talk about inflation. The Governor sent a letter to the Chancellor on the 16th of June in which he made the point eloquently about the inflation we're experiencing now is imported. He mentioned that world agricultural prices have gone up by 60%, oil prices have gone up 80%, and wholesale gas prices have gone up 160% in the past year. Given that's the case, don't you think that the government must have the courage to be honest with the public and explain that in the short term at least that take-home pay and living standards are going to be squeezed as a result of inflationary pressures in the global economy? If you are not upfront and honest explaining that, then that message isn't going to get across to people. And indeed, we'll get back to the 70s inflation when it ripped, and we won't get the genie back in the bottle.
I've understood the pressures that people face, and I'm very concerned about the impact that at the petrol pump, the high petrol price has on people's ability to afford to meet their weekly costs. I am concerned when people go to the supermarket that because of the international rise in food prices, people are being squeezed there as well and feeling the pinch. And I am concerned about gas and electricity bills. And we're trying to take action in each of these areas to help hard-pressed consumers. And one of the actions we've taken is, in response to the controversy over the 10p tax rate, we've extended the amount of money we're injecting in the economy so that 22 million people get the benefit of a 2.7 billion rise in money injected in the economy, and it's roughly about £120 for most people in the country. So that is one way we are trying to help people alleviate the bills. Look, the task at the moment is to keep the economy moving forward. I believe the British economy is far more resilient than it was facing the last two oil shocks and facing some of the problems we had when it was a world downturn in the early 90s. But our task in keeping the economy moving forward is to make sure that we retain and maintain the levels of public investment so that we can help the construction industry, is to do something to help people who are hard-pressed homeowners, and you have seen measures that we're taking to buy up some of the houses that are unsold in the market at the moment, and measures we're also taking to help people with their gas and electricity bills. And these are the things that we can do, both in the short term and, of course, the action we're taking in the medium term to reduce the dependence of this country on what has been the fastest rising product, and that's oil.
On the 10 pence tax issue, I am very pleased to see that you have taken on board the wise counsel of the Treasury Select Committee's report that came out at the weekend. So that's a good start. Terry, on poverty.
And I hope the wise counsel of the Working Pensions Select Committee on child poverty will be self-scoring. Prime Minister, you'll be aware that after some good progress in the last couple of years, the figures on child poverty have somewhat stalled. Very welcome measures in this year's budget, but part of this agenda has to be getting more people, particularly lone parents, into work. And in the benefit system, you have income disregards ranging from £5 a week to £95 a week, depending on the individual and the benefit they're on. Do you not think it's time to align some of these so that the disregards become incentives to try work rather than barriers as they often are?
Right, you're absolutely right. One of the biggest challenges is getting lone parents with children better chances of getting jobs that will give them a decent standard of income. We've got about 300,000 lone parents back to work. I think when we came into power, the figure was about 45%. I think it's over 55% now. But we want to get towards 70% of lone parents with young children getting the chance to work. We're changing the rules about the expectations we have of single parents to take a job, so that after a certain age, whether the child is at school or in nursery accommodation, we will give opportunities for training and then opportunities for work. You're right that we've given disregards, but we've also given bonuses for people who go into work. So if in London you go into work as a lone parent, you will get a certain amount of extra money per week, and in the rest of the country you get extra money as well. And we will look at what you say about bringing the disregards and the allowances together. But there are very substantial incentives now for lone parents either to work part-time or full-time, and I hope many more will take up that opportunity.
The Treasury is leading reviews of both childcare and housing benefit, and I have to say the analysis that they've done of the current issues is quite superb. When do you expect those to report, and when do you expect action to be taken on what they come up with?
Well, we're looking at how we can improve the welfare system in many different ways at the moment. On housing benefit, we're looking at how we can make it easier for people to return to work when in other circumstances they may lose housing benefit, how we can make sure that their income is secure. On incapacity benefit, we are making proposals about how we can help people go back into work more quickly by giving them extra support to get either training or advice that will enable them to come off incapacity benefit and go into work. So in each of these areas, incapacity benefit is very, very difficult because you're dealing with a whole range of problems. You're dealing with some people who are drug dependent and some people who are alcohol dependent, so we've got to look at special measures to deal with them. You're dealing with some people who, if they could get a particular type of job, could more easily come off incapacity benefits, so we've got to get the training to allow them to change career or to change the skill they have to get them jobs. But a lot of work is going into these pathways into work.
A major issue in addressing and tackling poverty, not least in-work poverty, is the equal pay gap. It's almost 40 years since the equal pay legislation, and we're still significantly away from it, particularly for those working part-time. The Equalities Bill that was published last week was, shall I say, fairly weak on taking action in the private sector. Can we expect to see that toughened up? Because if we truly got equal pay, that would eliminate most of the child poverty that we have.
But some of the cases that now arise on equal pay are actually public sector cases that we're having to deal with that have built over a long period of time. And a lot of the issue is about how different types of work are valued as is equivalent and equal, and a great deal of work has got to be done on that. But I agree we should continue to monitor what's happening in the private sector as well.
And just finally from me, it's now 60 years since the first legislation enacting beverage. There's been a plethora of rules, regulations that make it an extremely complex system. Do you not think it's time for a 2008 beverage, a new welfare commission, to look at exactly what we want from the welfare system, what we want it to do, that rights and responsibilities agenda, and how government interacts with the state?
Yeah, I think I applaud the work of your committee and the reports that you make. I mean, basically, the problem about unemployment in particularly has changed over these years. The biggest barrier to full employment in our country now is not the lack of jobs, it's the lack of skills. It's that young people and others do not have the skills that we need for the particular jobs that we're undertaking. There are 6 million workers in this country who are classified as unskilled. A large number of these unskilled jobs will not be needed 10 years from now. And we have got to persuade those people who do not have that skills to get the skills that are necessary for the jobs that are available. And that is one of the big changes that I think has got to be brought about. And when you talk about rights and responsibilities, I would say that the responsibility on the part of the unemployed person is not only to seek work, but to make sure that they seek a skill that will enable them to get a job. And we have a right, therefore, to require people to undergo the skills training that is necessary for them to get a job in return for them receiving support from the state when they're unemployed. And that I think, will be one of the biggest changes in the welfare system. You know, in all other situations, people have looked at unemployment as the lack of jobs for people to go to. Now, I'm afraid that one of the issues that we've got to deal with is the lack of skills that people have for the jobs that are available. There are still 600,000 vacancies, at least in this economy at the moment, and we need people with skills to take them up.
But again, there are perverse barriers and disincentives in the benefit system to people actually trying to improve their employability.
That's right, and we've always got. You're right, and your committee has looked at these, and we've always got to look at what are the barriers that are preventing people get back into work, or what are the disincentives in the system. Housing benefit has been a big issue. The costs of travel to work, the cost of training itself, the costs of childcare. These are big issues for people who are making big decisions about what work they do and whether they're going to travel further than the immediate vicinity to get a job that's available.
Tim, on the Green Agenda.
Prime Minister, picking up on your earlier answer to the Chair of the Transport Committee, is it the case that you're proud of the fact that during your 10 years as Chancellor, the rate of duty on petrol and diesel fell in real terms?
We've got to look at the situation on the ground. For the first few years, it rose very substantially, and then we had to look at the overall cost of energy itself. And where oil prices are very high themselves, they exercise an effect on demand. So it's the overall price that people pay for the good, not simply the tax rate, that makes the difference.
But during that decade, our understanding of climate change and the urgency and scale of the threat that it poses grew substantially. Oil prices were substantially below the levels they've reached in the last 18 months. And emissions from road transport were also rising. So was it a sensible policy to reduce the rate of tax on fuel in real terms?
I think you've got to look at all the factors that the chairman of the Transport Committee was raising when she gave me the initial statement about what she wanted to see happen. You've got to look at the overall economic environment. You've got to look at what is the overall price of energy itself, as well as look at the tax rate. And that's what we had to do, particularly after 2000.
During the decade you were at the Treasury, we had a benign international economic background, we had an expanding British economy, we had a period of relatively modest oil prices. If you were afraid even to maintain in real terms the level of tax on fuel against that background, do we have to assume now there's a more difficult economic prospect and much higher oil prices, but there's no chance at all you're going to use the tax system to encourage consumers to make greener choices?
Well, I think I should put this in its perspective. During these last 10 years, we introduced the climate change levy on business. We also reformed vehicle excise duty substantially, and I applaud the articles you've written on this in the last day or two. So it was not simply fuel duty on petrol and on diesel. There are an enormous number of reforms we've made to take account of the climate change issues, both in relation to transport and in relation to the environment as a whole. And I think the reform of environmental taxes over these last 10 years has been significant. We led the way in the climate change levy. We've led the way in emissions trading. We're leading the way in trying to create a carbon market in this country, a carbon market that can serve the rest of the world. And as you yourself have acknowledged, our VED reforms are to reward the least polluting cars and to tax more the most polluting cars.
Just on the climate change levy, you made a speech to the United Nations ambassadors 2 years ago in which you referred to the fact that the proceeds from the climate change levy are hypothecated to reduce business taxes and to fund low-carbon technology. If you accept that hypothecation is a good idea in relation to the climate change levy, why does Britain continue to resist the EU's suggestion that the auction proceeds from the sale of permits under the EU emissions trading system cannot be hypothecated in the same way, for example, perhaps, to fund research into carbon capture and storage?
Well, we're actually trying to do that research already. And as you know, on environmental research, we've set up the Environmental Technologies Institute, as well as seeking to win support of other countries for what is a very big investment in carbon capture and storage. As far as the climate change levy was concerned, we looked at this with business. We looked at this together, and we decided that the climate change levy could move business towards more environmentally friendly behaviour, and therefore, in return for that, we could reduce the national insurance, but also, of course, we could put proceeds to the Carbon Trust, which is doing an enormous amount of good work in reducing carbon emissions. I think you've got to look at these issues individually. I think the general principle of hypothecation would carry some difficulties, but I think there are specific instances when, for example, you're looking with business at a particular issue that you can do it.
With your vast, perhaps unique experience of the Treasury, would you agree that a green tax, if it's properly defined, is one which is introduced to change behaviour rather than primarily to raise revenue?
Absolutely. We're trying to change behaviour, but you've got to bear in mind, as the Chairman of the Transport Committee said, quoting the Chancellor, that one reason for taxation, perhaps the only reason for taxation, is to fund your public services. And you're trying to make sure that you're able to, in the public services you undertake, also undertake environmentally sensitive work.
You commissioned Lord Stern to look at the economics of climate change. Do you share his view that early action to tackle climate change is going to be cheaper and far more cost-effective than action in 10 or possibly even in 5 years' time?
Well, I think all of us in this committee do. I think both of us certainly do, and that's why we commissioned Stern. We've tried to take action quickly on some of the recommendations of Stern. But, you know, one of Stern's main proposals is you've got to build a global consensus so that what is done in one country is not offset by action by another country that actually harms the environment. So the process leading to Copenhagen is going to be very important. We've got to bring in all the emitters into this dialogue. And then, as I said in answer to Malcolm Bruce, I think you've got to also find a means by which you can help finance the environmentally friendly behaviour that we want to see undertaken by developing countries and emerging markets who will find it cheaper to build coal-fired power stations everywhere or to use other high-carbon sources, and who have got to be persuaded by incentives and money that is available to build alternative energy in their own country.
Do you think that Britain's role in helping to build that consensus, which you say is necessary, is going to be helped if we are seen to be a country where a coal-fired power station is built before we have viable carbon capture and storage, where we're increasing runway capacity for domestic flights instead of investing in railways, as France has done and Spain is doing, if we're a country where standards of energy efficiency in buildings remain far behind some other EU countries? Don't you think the fact that our domestic record is decidedly patchy is going to reduce our influence in the international negotiations?
I disagree with you entirely. We're investing substantially in railways. That's why there are more people using the railways now than at any time for many years. And the number of passengers using public transport is growing substantially. We're investing in the carbon-free home. I mean, we've announced that we will build carbon-free homes, and we will give fiscal incentives to do so. And I think you must have seen last week's paper by John Hutton on renewables. We are investing heavily in alternative sources of energy. And one of the things we're trying to do is persuade other countries to form a global energy technologies institute, so that the work that we're doing and about to do in our Energy Technologies Institute to look for alternative sources of energy can be mirrored by what happens in other countries. I think you've got to accept, despite the criticisms you make, that we are a world leader in looking for alternative sources of energy, nuclear, renewables. We're a world leader in some of the sources of alternative energy, and we're a world leader and want to be an even bigger world leader in the research for alternative sources for the future. And as for public transport, I don't think any government has invested more in both railways and buses and alternatives to the car and public transport than this government.
Do you agree that climate change is the most urgent problem now facing mankind?
I think it is one of the great challenges of our time. I mean, we have at the moment, as a world, to come to terms with the fundamental changes that are taking place in our economy and in the shift of economic power that is happening, and to make sure that people are not impoverished by that. And we have at the same time, and many of the solutions are similar, to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels so that we can have a sustainable environment. I would say that the challenge of global change at the moment is not only to have free and open markets and the flexibility that's necessary, but to make it both inclusive and sustainable.
On that point, Chancellor, the green taxes, the existing air passenger duty regime has an exemption for passengers on transfer flights within the UK, but under the proposals for the new plane-per-plane duty, that exemption will be removed. What that means, at a stroke, Chancellor, is that UK passengers can save... sorry, Prime Minister. But I've had 7 years of these Chancellor.
He's asked me these questions for 10 years as Chairman of
exactly.
the Treasury Committee.
What that means, Prime Minister, is that UK passengers will save significant amounts of tax by using non-UK hubs, such as breaking long-haul flights from the UK to Amsterdam. For example, if I was flying from Glasgow to Mumbai and through London, I'd have to pay 3 times, and it would cost me about £60. If I chose to go via Amsterdam, I'd pay once, and it would cost £10. Now, that doesn't make sense at all in terms of a green taxation. And further, commercial delivery companies like FedEx or DHL, they will be paying the new tax on freight-only flights, in contrast to the exemption from the existing APD. What that will mean, Chancellor, is that they will have the opportunity... Prime Minister, what that will mean, Prime Minister...
I think this is a question for the Chancellor.
They will have the opportunity to go to Amsterdam, pay nothing, and take their goods in by road, further cluttering up the roads. So something really needs to be done about this policy.
Well, I think part of the measures on APT are for consultation, and no doubt the Chancellor will listen to your representations on that matter. I don't think anybody would deny, however, that the decision of a previous government and our government that air passenger duty has to be paid, and it's got to be paid fairly, is the right decision if we're going to assess the cost to climate change of air travel. And I know there are many representations about that, but I think the duty that is levied generally is the right duty.
But there's a big international issue here, because I'm informed that the US Embassy has formally notified the UK government of its significant policy and legal concerns, where the UK government could possibly be breaching the 1994 Chicago Convention.
Well, these are matters that will have to be looked at.
Okay.
I haven't seen this particular
Thank you, Prime Minister. Barry.
Prime Minister,
thank you.
This summer, there's a lot of vulnerable and fearful people out there in our country who can blame the situation they're in on what even the Financial Times can suggest are an incompetent, reckless, downright greedy banking system in our country. And what they see is the position they're in is down to these people that have served them badly. Well, what do you think about that sort of view?
I think the off-balance sheet activities of some banks that have caused many of the problems that we've got, and the write-offs that are now taking place, is something that should never have happened. And we need a regulatory system that can pick up more information when firms are using off-balance sheet methods for financing some of their activities. And the unfortunate thing is that we're talking about probably 400 to 800 billion of monies, mainly in America, that have been off balance sheet, that are now being brought on balance sheet and causing a huge amount of difficulty. So there are reforms to the financial system that are necessary. One, the transparency of balance sheets, so that these off balance sheet activities cannot be recorded in the way that they were before and have got to be on balance sheet. The credit rating agencies have got to do a better job, and that is one of the issues that is before us. And I would say also that where there are to be write-offs, they should happen now, because what we cannot have is a situation where months from now people have not disclosed write-offs that they know have got to take place now. And I think these measures have got to be taken by the financial system. I think what it's also revealed is that you have national regulators that do not have all the information about international companies that are operating in many continents. And you are going to have a better system of global financial supervision. And in many cases, we're dealing with a situation where national supervisors have been outgrown by global financial flows. And so we need a better system of supervision at a global level.
But, Prime Minister, these people are in a mess now. And the banks that got them in the mess in the first place are making it even worse because they're not lending to anyone. They're not lending to small businesses, they're not lending to people who want to get a home, and they're not lending to each other. So it is a crisis for them now, and they want something. They see you and your government, our government, as the people that should do something about it. And many of the experts say, if you don't act soon, if our government doesn't act soon, the banking and financial crisis will deepen this summer, and we need urgent action. What urgent action are we going to give them?
Our aim is to keep the economy moving forward. That's why the Bank of England injected £50 billion into the markets only a few weeks ago. So action has already been taken to improve the flow of money. That's why we're taking action in the housing market itself. We've announced that we will buy many unsold properties in the market to enable the housing market to move forward, and we're looking at other measures by which we can help mortgage finance, so that in a situation in Britain where there is demand for housing, we can actually find a way that the market and the financial markets can satisfy that demand. And we are aware also that consumers are under pressure, and that's why 22 million will get a tax cut. That's why we've raised the winter allowance. That's why we've got the low-income support for fuel bills, and that's why we're trying to move forward with other measures as well. So we are doing things.
I accept there's some action going on, some really important action on, but many of my constituents will say, is it enough? But can I just press on one thing you brought up earlier about the Leach report and how we don't need any longer very many unskilled people in our economy? Isn't it time that we had a total moratorium on immigration into this country that is unskilled? It is stoking up real problems, whether they come from the Indian subcontinent or they come from Albania or Romania, anywhere else. Unskilled people coming here without the English language are going to be a real problem for the future of our country. Isn't it time we acted even more firmly than we have?
Well, as you know, we've introduced the new points system, and the points system means that unskilled workers coming from countries outside the European Union who are not needed by our economy will not be welcome into this country. So the point system deals with exactly the problem that you've raised. Where there are skilled workers that can contribute to the economy, we will, under the point system, allow them in. Where they have no skills to offer, they will not be allowed in. As far as Europe is concerned, we took special measures for Romania and Bulgaria, and we will continue to monitor that situation.
Thank you. We now move to the final theme, international flashpoints. Mike Yates.
Thank you. Prime Minister, there's been a great deal of debate recently about what the international community or individual countries can do where there are problems, humanitarian problems or political problems in different parts of the world. And the words of the United Nations General Assembly resolution in 2005, where national authorities manifestly failed to protect their populations. We will have some specific questions about particular countries, but can I just begin by asking you what you understand by the responsibility to protect?
Well, the responsibility to protect is, as you know, is a principle adopted by the United Nations in circumstances where there are humanitarian issues, ethnic cleansing, where there is genocide, and it's incumbent upon the international community to act. It's also got to take into account that it is a just cause, that we operate on the right intention, that it's a last resort, that any action is proportional, that it must have reasonable prospects of achieving that goal. I think the biggest problem we face actually is that we do not have the means by which we can take the action that you would want to see. So whether it was Rwanda or whether it was Darfur, we do not have, beyond the number of peacekeepers and the humanitarian aid that we can provide, the means at the moment by which the international community can offer the help for stability and reconstruction that you're talking about. So I think we need the UN to be reformed in such a way that in addition to humanitarian help and the 100,000 peacekeepers there is a civil society presence, that you have police, you have judges, you have people that can offer their skills to help reconstruct failed states in a way that would mean that your humanitarian aid could lead to the satisfactory restoration of civil order and a civil society in these countries.
But in the meantime, before we get that reform of the international institutions, the strengthening of the United Nations, and many people have been trying for many years to achieve that, we have to deal with the United Nations system as it is today. What do you do if you're not able to get a Security Council resolution and the international community collectively to act? What can we in this country, what can the Europeans do in cases, for example, like Burma, where you were quoted in an interview to the BBC World Service in May, where you said we have to get agreement of the international community, and it's been difficult to get all countries to agree to a common approach. What do we do when we don't get that common approach?
Well, there are some cases where, as you know, and that has happened in Eastern Europe or in Africa, where unilaterally we will provide the support that we can do. There are some cases where we will act as a European Union to take action that is necessary. There are some cases where we will act with other allies to make sure that we can do the right thing, but that is less preferable than getting agreement at the United Nations. And I suppose when you were talking about responsibility to protect, we should reform the peacekeeping system so that there are regional peacekeepers. For example, the African Union can do more, and we do need this post-conflict response facility that is not good enough at the moment, even when the will is there.
But there are people internationally who are saying that we're never going to get the Chinese or the Russians to agree in the Security Council, so we're not going to get the international legitimacy. And therefore, there is an idea going around, and Senator John McCain has taken it up, of a so-called League of Democracies. Does our government have an attitude to that? What do you think about that suggestion? Would it actually be helpful, or would it actually undermine the United Nations?
Well, I think the United Nations should be reformed, and I think we should try and get an agreement about reform. And I do believe there is more will to make these reforms than it might be suggested by your questions. The Security Council itself, in the end, will have to be reformed to be more representative. But at the same time, if we could agree on the purpose of action by the United Nations before we talk about who is going to do what under certain circumstances and which countries have got the votes, I think we could get quite far. We did reform humanitarian aid. We have done quite a lot about peacekeeping. There's now 100,000 peacekeepers, as I say, which is a very substantial number, bigger than at any time, I think, in the history of the world. But you've got to go further on these reforms. And I think talking to Commonwealth countries, to China, to India, to the Americans and to the Europeans, there is the potential to reach agreement on many of these reforms. And I think we should be pushing this quite hard over the next year.
So you're not inclined to go along with this idea of a League of Democracies?
Well, there are various meetings. I think there's a concert of democracies at the moment. I think there is another group that meets together to look at what democracies can do. Obviously, the strongest form of government in the world for the future is where there are democracies. But I think we should try to reform the United Nations itself.
rather than setting up ad hoc alliances with the United States, the Australians, the
Well, I think there will
Europeans.
always be ad hoc alliances where you can't reach agreement internationally in the United Nations. You will work with those countries where you can do so. But it's far preferable to have a decision of the international community and to give the United Nations both the strength to act and the representative decision-making process it should have.
Okay, thank you. We'll move now to the situation in Iraq. James Arbuthnot.
Prime Minister, I'll ask you some questions about Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan is much the harder issue to resolve, but if I may start with Iraq, may I ask, when were you last in Basra?
I was there a few months ago, and I really don't want to give details of my future plans. But I
wouldn't ask that.
I've seen and heard from visits that ministers have had about the most recent situation in Basra, and I think it's true to say that after the action by Prime Minister Maliki in taking his own troops into the Basra area, there has been substantial progress in dealing with the militias who have been operating in Basra. I think the Defence Secretary described how it was possible for him to walk in the streets of Basra in a way that didn't happen before. And really we've got these 4 tasks that we've got to do. Do you want me to describe them, or would you prefer to ask your other question first?
Can I ask you, my impression from being there last week was that Basra city has been utterly transformed by the action that Prime Minister Maliki took in March. When we were there last year, the rocket and mortar attacks seemed to be coming in every couple of hours or so. We were there for 5 days last week without a single such rocket or mortar attack. Yet, and our convoy was stuck in a traffic jam because of the prosperity of the country. Yet nobody seems to know about it. Why is that, do you think?
Nobody seems to know about the.
Nobody seems to know about the transformation of Basra.
Well, I've been talking about it myself, and I think others have been talking about it. But there are, as I say, 4 tasks that are important that we've got to still undertake. One is we've got to train the Iraqi forces, and one of the problems that Prime Minister Maliki ran into was that some of his forces were insufficiently trained, and of course there had to be support given from the Americans and from us at the time of his exercise. So we have started new ways of helping the training of the Iraqi forces and the Iraqi police. I think the second thing is we have got to build on this success in Basra by having local government elections. So we persuade people to come out of the informal and sometimes the violent ways that people have chosen to conduct their activity in Basra into representative government. So I hope there'll be local government elections soon. We've got to complete the transfer of the airport to civilian use, and that's where many of our troops are at the moment. And we've got to do what I think you're hinting at, build some prosperity in Basra, giving people an economic and social stake in the future of the area. Now, these are the 4 tasks that we talk about Overwatch, but these are the 4 tasks that, moving from our combat role to an Overwatch role, these are the tasks that we've still got to undertake and complete.
Can I ask about that first task? The one thing we were told by the British troops when we were there was that they were doing an absolutely essential job in training the Iraqi troops, and that the Iraqi troops in turn were doing an essential job in mentoring the Iraqi police. And that it would be quite wrong for our troops to be pulled out prematurely from that job in order to fit into some political numbers game dictated in this country. Would you agree with that?
There is neither an artificial timetable nor there is any political numbers game being played. I've said all along that we'll do what is necessary, taking into account the views of military commanders on the ground, and that we will complete the work of training the Iraqi forces. Now, we have changed the way that we train the Iraqi forces over recent months, as you've probably discovered in your visit to Basra, but the task still remains to be done. I think we've trained up 30,000, but there's a lot more to do.
So the only minor political sting I will put into this is that I hope we can have no more predictions of 2,500 or stuff like that, because it is the capabilities that we need to put there rather than the numbers that are important?
I think it's right to suggest the direction in which we want to go. And we had 44,000 troops in Iraq at one stage. By the beginning of last year, it was 5,500. It is now 4,100. The direction of travel is clear. But I've always made it clear that the final decisions about the actual movement and reconfiguration of troops will be based on the situation we find and on the advice of military commanders on the ground.
Turning now to Afghanistan, where tragically the deaths of our servicemen and women have been very high recently. One of the key issues of Afghanistan is their relations with Pakistan, which aren't good, frankly. Pakistan says it can only stop terrorists crossing the border into Afghanistan if it's allowed to secure the border, which neither country will agree. And President Karzai has threatened to take troops into Pakistan if need be. What can we do to reduce the tensions there?
Well, we are working with the Americans and the Pakistani government as well as the Afghan government on these issues. It is clear that this is a very difficult area. I think you, like me, who've studied this, know that it's one of the most difficult terrains in the world. I think we've got to have the cooperation that is necessary with the Pakistani government. It would be better if there were better relations between the Afghan government and the Pakistani government. And we've got to move our troops in the right way to assure that we can protect them from the insurgents that are coming in from Pakistan.
But all the while, the commitment of NATO seems a bit half-hearted. You've called for greater burden sharing, and I think you're right on that. The number of troops do seem to be creeping up, but there's a sense in Afghanistan that people there don't think we're there for the long haul. How can we change that?
I think people do know that this is a long-term commitment. I was at the NATO summit in Bucharest. We've got around 40 countries that are contributing to this exercise. You are absolutely right to say that burden sharing is of the essence for the future. If, for example, the Dutch or the Canadians that have suffered quite large losses, as we have suffered losses in recent months, did not feel that other countries were contributing properly, then they themselves, as has been said by the Canadians and the Dutch, would have to review their position as well. So it is very important that there is burden sharing. The French, as you know, are bringing extra forces in. That will allow American Marines to move into the south. There is an attempt to bring together many of the countries of Eastern Europe, but the whole of Europe, to contribute to both increased training for police and the provision of equipment like helicopters. We set up this helicopter trust fund. It's had a number of countries contributing to it. We now have offers from some of the Eastern European countries to provide what is vitally needed equipment for Afghanistan. So there is evidence of greater burden sharing, but I would be the first to say that more has got to be done. As far as the Afghan people are concerned, I mean, our aim must be that the Afghan army is strengthened in its ability to run its own affairs, and that the Afghan police are sufficiently strong that they can, free of corruption, tackle many of the problems in the country. And I do think it's going to be important also to build up local government as well as greater efficiency in national government and the economic and social development programme there, if Afghans themselves are going to have a stake in the future. But I will never forget this, that the restoration of the Taliban to power would affect us in Britain, in our communities, as much as it would affect the Afghan people.
But I entirely agree with that. What do you think, this is my final question, about the prospects for reducing the corruption that you've just referred to in Afghanistan? What prospect is there of President Karzai achieving a major change in that before the elections of next year and the year after?
Well, as you probably know, we've been talking to President Karzai about giving him additional support so that we can have a civil service that allows decisions that are made to be properly implemented. And he has asked, and we are giving him advice on how to do this. The training of the police, a corrupt-free police force, is being supervised by the Germans, who have brought additional trainers into Afghanistan for that. I agree with you that these are problems that arise particularly because we've got a heroin trade operating from Afghanistan, and it's important that we increase the number of poppy-free provinces, as has happened over the last few years, but obviously not all has yet been achieved. There is a huge amount still to do. So the battle against corruption is a better civil service, better policing, better local government, action against heroin, and these are the things that we're trying to undertake and complete. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We'll now move to the Middle East. Philip Stark, please.
Thank you. Prime Minister, I want to focus on just one particular aspect of the situation in Israel-Palestine. I mean, I accept and I think we all welcome the fact that there do seem to be a number of very positive moves across the region and between the Israeli and Palestinian Authority governments to move the situation forward, and a great deal of international engagement, notwithstanding, for example, the terrorist attack yesterday in West Jerusalem and some continued violence on both sides. There is an improvement, but there's one aspect, which is the one I want to concentrate on, which is not improving. In fact, it's going in the opposite direction, and it's an aspect that could sabotage the entire process, and that's the continued construction in illegal settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The Israeli government has announced a whole raft of new permissions for over 2,500 new homes in these settlements. And since Annapolis, the rate of settlement expansion has actually increased. Given that the UK government is on record as saying that the settlements are an obstacle to peace, what can the UK and the EU actually do to insist that there is no further settlement building?
As you know, negotiations between Prime Minister Olmert and Mr Abbas have continued. A lot of detailed work is being done. The barriers to these being successful are not only the delicate problems that are raised about the future of refugees, Jerusalem, the borders, the map and everything else, but also what you rightly point to, these provocations. One is, of course, continued bombings and continued missiles being hurled into Israeli places, and you have, like yesterday, these problems that arise from what seems to be a terrorist attack. But I agree with you also that it is not acceptable that at the point that we are trying to get to a peace settlement, we have the problems with additional settlements being announced or planned. As you know, there was a report in the middle of June about plans to build more houses in East Jerusalem. We made it absolutely clear, as did the Americans, that such activity had the potential to harm all the negotiations going forward. And we said at the time, and I repeat, that the settlement program should be stopped, because it's not only causing distress amongst the Palestinians, but it is actually preventing people seeing that there is, as I believe possible, a resolution to the problems that have eluded us for many, many decades. And
Indeed,
there is a two-state solution possible.
Well, absolutely, Prime Minister. The two-state solution is the only agreed international solution and would be in the interests of both Israel and Palestine if that could be achieved. But on the ground, the facts being created by the continued expansion of the settlements and indeed the continued abstraction of Palestinian land for the wall, those facts are foreclosing an eventual solution, even if all the other matters do get sorted out. And words, Prime Minister, do not seem to be enough. Even the words of the, important though Britain is, even the words of the Secretary of State of America doesn't seem to be having any effect. Why is the EU, for example, not considering taking action? Because there are levers the EU can use. And on that point, can I press you, why has there been an agreement to deepen the EU-Israel Association Agreement in the margins of the General Affairs Council? Why was there no consideration given to using that as a lever to insist that the Israelis stopped settlement expansion before any such deepening would be considered? That's an actual lever that we've got. Why don't we use it?
Well, there are many points of negotiation and discussion at the moment. We held in Britain a Palestinian investment conference. And
yes, but Prime Minister, sorry, can I just stop you there? Everybody's in favour of that. Everybody understands the need to expand the Palestinian economy. But if this settlement expansion continues, there cannot be a two-state solution because there will not be the land to create a contiguous and viable Palestinian state, nor a state in which an economy can properly function. Why are we not using the levers we have to at least get a freeze?
We're taking action on settlements by making it absolutely clear we do not see that as an acceptable way of moving towards a peaceful settlement of all the issues. But
I'm really sorry to insist, but
you are
we
insisting,
have
but
made that
I need to be able to
clear.
finish my answers as well. And equally, we've got to bear in mind that consistent provocation with bombings into the Israeli territory is also making it difficult for these peace negotiations to go ahead. Now, I think it's good that despite all these provocations, that people are still talking and still making progress, and I would urge them to continue to do so. But we've made our position on the settlements clear to Prime Minister Olmert when I've talked to him directly, and on other occasions when the Foreign Secretary has visited Israel. But we also make it clear to those people who are conducting violence on the part of the Palestinians that it's completely unacceptable also to try to disrupt the peace process by persistent bombings or incursions into the Israeli areas.
I would absolutely agree with all of that about the violence, but the settlement issue is a separate issue. There can be no security argument on the part of the Israelis for expanding settlements. It is purely and simply establishing facts on the ground, which will be very, very difficult to undo, and it has the potential to sabotage the eventual solution. And I just press it. Was there any consideration in the discussions at the recent Council on the deepening of the association agreement on making further movement conditional on a settlement freeze?
I think when I've discussed it with my colleagues in the European Union, there's been a very big desire to see the bigger picture, that although there are provocations at the moment on both sides, that it is very important that people see that despite the attempts, sometimes by people who are loosely associated with those people who are doing the negotiations, or not at all, to either do settlements or alternatively to have these bombings in the Israeli territories, that we must continue with the negotiations, and we must also continue with looking at how these bigger issues about the future of Jerusalem, about the return of refugees, about the territories that we're talking about and the mapping of them, it's very important that these discussions should continue. Nobody wants to see the settlements or the outposts, nobody wants to see the incursions through violence, but it is very important to see the bigger picture as well, and my colleagues in the European Union want to see that bigger picture and see it enacted in practice.
Well, then, turning to that bigger picture, do you actually think that if settlement expansion continues, there will be the possibility of establishing a viable Palestinian state on what's left?
I think everybody knows that this is one of the barriers to the final success of any peace talks. There are many barriers to that have got to be removed, and I think it's our responsibility to work in all these areas to see if we can get the two sides to the talks working more closely together with the prospect, and I believe there is a real prospect, most of these problems are solvable, with the prospect of these problems being solved in the next few months.
Thank you. We'll move on to the difficult and appalling situation in Zimbabwe. Phil Willis.
Thank you very much. Prime Minister, undoubtedly you inherited foreign policy in terms of Iraq, Afghanistan and the Middle East from your predecessor, and you were dealt a very difficult hand. As far as Africa is concerned, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, I think all of us around this table would accept that your efforts in terms of the call for action and immunisation, debt relief in Africa, were really quite outstanding, and I'm quite prepared to put that on the record. Do you not feel, therefore, incredibly disappointed that with regards to Zimbabwe, that your efforts so far have been regarded as little more than ineffectual grandstanding, whilst Robert Mugabe simply cocks a snoop at you and the rest of the international community? And why is that?
I don't think you're right in your analysis about that. I think what has changed, and it's a huge change from where we were a few years ago, is that most of the major African leaders now recognise that they cannot associate themselves with a Mugabe regime that tries to intimidate people during elections, that practices violence against its citizens, and that, of course, has either arrested or actually intimidated some of the leaders of the opposition. So I think you'll see, even from the announcements of the African Union in its statement 2 days ago, that African leaders will not, again, be happy with a situation that they can tolerate the status quo in Zimbabwe. So there is movement. The question is how quickly that movement of opinion, working perhaps with the United Nations, the African Union, SADC, the United Nations, can influence the change that needs to take place in Zimbabwe itself. I don't think it's us versus the Africans as you're presenting it. I think everybody, with very few exceptions, now recognises the need for the status quo in Zimbabwe to change quickly.
Okay, well, can we look at something that you can directly influence, Prime Minister? You have made very, very strong comments and condemnation of the Mugabe regime, and particularly the loss of life in Zimbabwe and the torture and the abuse of human rights. And the Foreign Secretary has made exactly the same comments. How, therefore, can you argue that the 13,000 Zimbabweans currently seeking refuge and asylum in the UK are anything other than refugees entitled to the full protection under the UN Constitution? And how is it, are you not a little bit embarrassed, at least, if not ashamed, that at one time you're denouncing Mugabe's criminal cabal, and at the other time you are sanctioning the mass deportation of people back to Zimbabwe?
Well, I just say to you, we continue to look at that situation. It's a very
Is that the only answer you can give?
Yeah, we will continue to look at that situation.
So while South Africa has got over 1 million refugees on its border, and we're trying to get Mbeki to do more, all we can say is we'll look at the situation.
Yeah, but we are continuing to examine each case where someone is seeking asylum has got to be looked at individually. But we continue to look at the general situation. We've got to bear in mind many factors operating in Zimbabwe, where we must make sure that we protect people who may be at risk.
So you don't regard these as legitimate refugees in the UN Convention sense?
I didn't say that. I said that each application is treated on its merits, but we continue to look at the general situation.
But you know that if in fact they agree, the current Zimbabweans in the UK agree that they will go back to Zimbabwe at some future date, they get aid and support cut off from them. I mean, how is that sort of an example of Britain using its humanitarian muscle to actually support people in the most enormous distress?
Well, I think I'm telling you that we look at the individual case on its merits and see what we can actually do to help.
Well, let's look back in December 2006, your predecessor, Tony Blair, together with President Bush, President Putin, and 138 other leaders, attended the UN World Summit. On that, and you mentioned this earlier in your remarks to Mike Gates, a resolution was passed which was to condemn the use of torture and terror, and indeed in situations across the world, and indeed to give protection to nations as an international community. And as a result of that, Resolution 1738 was passed in December 2006. Why have you not, Prime Minister, under the auspices of that resolution, actually called for the naming of Mugabe and indeed his henchmen, who you have proof have conducted themselves in a way which was totally against the Resolution 1738, so that they can, when they leave Zimbabwe, be arrested and brought before the International Criminal Court?
Well, we are imposing sanctions on individual members of the regime, and we are considering at the moment, and will extend those sanctions, both financial sanctions and travel sanctions. So it is not a question of us failing to take action against individual members of the regime in terms of both sanctions about the financial affairs and the family's financial affairs and the travel sanctions. But that is what we are doing at the moment. I wouldn't like to comment on anything further.
Okay, Prime Minister. One of the means by which Mugabe is able to maintain his presence and indeed cock a snoop at the international community is because he's still being funded. and it's still being funded partly through the UK with our $70 million worth of aid, which we're the largest supporter of Zimbabwe, and that's to our credit, Prime Minister. That's not a criticism. Can I just finish my question? Okay, can I just say, is there not an opportunity now for you as the British Prime Minister and Britain as the largest donor to not actually get all the donors together, to actually withdraw that aid and to agree a new package which would be entirely commensurate with a new political regime in Zimbabwe? Can't you use your financial muscle to do that?
Well, first of all, the aid is going directly to people in Zimbabwe. It is not being channeled through the regime.
They're not taking any of it for themselves?
We would try to avoid that at all costs, but the aid is going directly to people in Zimbabwe through humanitarian agencies. And, of course, one of the problems has been at certain points the government stopping the work of non-governmental organisations in Zimbabwe. But look, the major pressure at the moment, and I think we've got to put this in its proper context. We've had an election, first of all, that was won by the MDC, where the ZANU-PF came well behind the MDC. We've had an attempt at a second election that is a travesty of justice, and during that election the regime has blood on its hands for what has happened. We now have the pressure that I think is growing from the African Union countries and from the community of the United Nations that the status quo cannot be held, that action has got to be taken. There are discussions about what form of transition there could be. There's enormous pressure for that to happen. I hope that a UN envoy will go very soon to Zimbabwe, to Harare, to put that pressure on. But I think virtually the whole international community is saying the status quo cannot continue. The MDC has got to be recognised for the electoral support it had. There will be no support for this regime until democracy is restored. We will intensify the sanctions unless action is taken to change the status quo. And I don't believe that President Mugabe could take any comfort from most of the African Union members who have walked away from him and are refusing to support the status quo in Zimbabwe.
And do you believe, Prime Minister, that by the time this committee next meets you, that Mugabe will have gone?
Well, I hope the transition can be quick. And I think when a regime loses an election, as it did in the first election, and then tries to intimidate and claims a hollow victory from a second election where they have intimidated their opponents out of participating in the campaign, they can have no legitimacy at all.
Can I bring in Sir Patrick Cormack on the same issue?
Prime Minister, nobody can doubt your good intentions and good faith on this one, and I would like to echo what Phil Willis said about your record in Africa. But really, we have got to be tougher with this man. I'm glad you stripped him, or arranged to strip him of his knighthood. I suggest in all your public utterances you strip him of the title of President and just refer to him as Mugabe. And could I ask you again, though, on the point that Phil Willis raised, surely we could have a more positive response from you on the refugees. I mean, if we'd had responses like that before the war, what would have happened to many of those Jews who fled from Hitler's Germany? And Mugabe's Zimbabwe, although much smaller as a problem, is not a million miles from Hitler's Germany.
We are trying to change this regime at the moment, working with other countries to do so, because we don't recognise that the Mugabe regime has legitimacy. I've said I'll look at the issues that have been raised. We have dealt with these cases on an individual basis.
But, Prime Minister, can you not just, before this committee, say that there will be a presumption of being a refugee as far as anyone from Zimbabwe is concerned if they ask for political asylum?
Well, I'll look at what you say. I'm more interested, if I may say so, in getting quicker action in dealing with the transition in Zimbabwe itself, and I think that would be your first priority as well. And I don't believe that the African Union decisions are preventing the action that is necessary. There is an acceptance now that there wasn't a few months ago, that the status quo is completely unacceptable. African leader, one by one, They are walking away from the Mugabe regime. And I think it's important over the next few days to build on that recognition that with United Nations and African Union pressure, the status quo can be changed.
And finally, would you agree in general terms with what Archbishop Tutu said at the weekend?
Which particular statement are you referring to?
Well, when he said that he thought it might be appropriate and might be necessary for a peacekeeping force to be put into Zimbabwe.
Well, there has been some discussion of an international peacekeeping force, and that is an option that is obviously on the table. But I think we've got to bear in mind that all the pressure at the moment is political pressure to try and achieve a desired result. That we've got to listen also to what the opposition in Zimbabwe are saying to us about what they think is the right course that they wish to see pursued. And we've got to get the mediators working very quickly to achieve the transition we want to see.
Thank you.
Prime Minister, you've mentioned several times the African Union and its role. Are you disappointed that the African Union, not just on Zimbabwe, but on Darfur, has actually been unable to take more decisive action and more effective action? And is there an intrinsic problem within the African Union that there are a number of countries there which are not democracies, and in fact some which have worse human rights record even than Robert Mugabe?
Well, that is an issue, but I think we've also got to remember the African Union is building itself up gradually as an institution that is capable of exercising decision-making power. Much of the work in the Zimbabwe elections has not been done by the African Union, it's been done by SADC, who had very clear electoral rules, made it absolutely clear that the Mugabe regime had broken these rules, and I think we've got to help both SADC and the African Union to play their full part. As far as Darfur is concerned, my own view is that we've been prevented from doing many of the things we want to do by the situation on the ground in Darfur itself. There was a period when we thought we could get rebel groups together, and then there was this incursion by the rebel groups. There was a period when we thought we could get cooperation from the regime itself, and I think a lot of what is to happen for Darfur is a bringing together of the forces inside Sudan and get them to come together for peacekeeping talks.
Michael Connaughton, last question.
When we're asking a further question about Iraq, I thought someone might have asked it. Given the proposals on the carbon law in Iraq, which basically will hand over the oil resources of Iraq to the same oil companies that were there when the UK used to run that country, and the proposal for 50 permanent bases for the USA in Iraq, do you share any disquiet that I have and other members who have, not just members of Parliament, members of the public, that in fact it is turning out to be a war for oil, and that what will be left will be American imperialism, which will cause the same problems it caused for British jurisdiction when we tried to run the country to take its oil?
Well, I don't think the Americans are talking in the long run about 50 bases. I don't think that's the fact. But equally, you raise an important question about who is going to develop these resources of Iraq, not just for the people of Iraq, but for the benefit of the whole world. You've got a very substantial amount of oil that could make a difference, actually, even now, to the demand and supply equation for oil. I actually held a meeting of potential investors in the Basra area, because we have set up this group to provide an economic plan for the development of Basra. And I found that there were many new companies that had never been in Iraq before, not the old companies, many new companies wanting to help develop the resources of Iraq with the Iraqi people. And so I think we've got to look at the situation on the ground, and there is a tremendous amount of work being done by our representative and by the Iraqi Development Forum to try and bring new investors into Iraq so that we can actually get Iraqi people securing the benefit of their own resource by a partnership between the Iraqi people and these investors.
Prime Minister, you recently, yesterday, made some change to the list of terrorist organisations with regard to Hezbollah. And one of the issues that was quoted as the reasons for that was the role of Hezbollah in Iraq. Clearly, that is not done by Hezbollah coming from Lebanon directly to Iraq. They are going through Iran. And would you like to assess what the role of Iran is at the moment in assisting the people who are killing our troops in Iraq and the potential difficulties that Iran is currently causing to us in Iraq?
Well, first of all, can I just say about the announcement yesterday, and it was about the military wing of Hezbollah, not about its legitimate political and social wings. It was about evidence that we had accumulated over quite a long period of time of its involvement in terrorism, not just in Iraq, but also in the occupied Palestinian territories. So that was the basis on which the prescription is to be made, and the order extending prescription to the military wing is to be agreed. As far as Iran and its influence on Iraq is concerned, I think one of the things that happened after Prime Minister Maliki intervened in the Basra area is that a number of the foreign-backed militias that were working in Basra were pushed out. And I think what I'm hoping happens in the Basra area, and I'm pleased that Mr. Arbuthnot found what I know from the other accounts I've received is happening there, is that there is a greater willingness on the part of local people in the Basra area to take more control over their own affairs and to act within the ambit of democratic or traditional politics rather than to resort to paramilitary activity. And when paramilitary activity or military activity is pushed out, then the Iranian influence in the province is also reduced. So what we're really looking for in Iraq, and I think it is a time of opportunity, is that as we move from combat to overwatch, we are able to see the Iraqis move from a situation where they've relied on British and American forces to a situation where they have their own armed forces maintaining the military peace. We have police in Iraq that are corrupt-free, that are maintaining law and order. And we get to a position where we have local government that is working effectively in the Basra area with elections, I hope, by the end of the year. And at the same time, the economic and social development programme that Mr. Connerty talked about, a programme that will give Iraqis in this area a great deal of prosperity, because there is an enormous amount of oil wealth, a great port in the area, lots of scope for economic and social development. They will then feel that they have an economic and social stake in the future. And I believe that these trends are underway. A year ago, I don't think you could have said that. I think now, because of the way that we have conducted ourselves and the way that the Iraqi government has been more determined to reach out, let's put it like that, things look as if they're in a better position, and we want that more stable situation to extend itself into local government elections and to really the forces of democracy gaining greater control.
Thank you.
Well, it's been an extremely wide-ranging 2.5 hours, Prime Minister. Thank you very much. Order, order.
Thank you.
Very well done, sir.
Portcullis House, Line 1, the Boothroyd Room. 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 Portcullis House, Line 1, the Boothroyd Room.